A wealthy businessman takes his daughter to the park, and a young beggar cries out, "That's my twin sister." The man is shocked to see the girl looks exactly like his daughter. What happens next is truly unexpected. The crisp autumn wind rustled through the colorful leaves of Central Park as James Carter glanced at his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. At 45, the tech tycoon had mastered billion-dollar deals, but felt oddly nervous about spending an afternoon with his 10-year-old daughter, Emily. Their relationship had always been distant, marked by brief moments between his endless business trips and meetings. "Dad, look at the ducks." Emily's excited voice snapped him out his thoughts. Her golden hair shimmered in the sunlight as she ran toward the pond, her designer dress swaying with each step. James couldn't help but smile. She reminded him so much of her mother. "Be careful, sweetheart," he called out, quickening his pace to catch up. This afternoon was supposed to be different. After his assistant pointed out he had missed Emily's last 3 school events, James cleared his schedule, hoping this would be a turning point in their relationship. The park was bustling with families enjoying the pleasant weather. Children played on the grass while parents chatted on nearby benches. It all felt so normal, so far removed from the high-pressure world James usually lived in. He watched as Emily tossed breadcrumbs to the eager ducks, her laughter echoing across the water. "Want some ice cream?" he asked, spotting a vendor nearby. Emily's eyes lit up, and for a moment, James felt like he was finally doing something right. As they walked toward the ice cream cart, he noticed other parents watching them. He was used to being recognized. His face had graced countless magazine covers, but something about their gazes made him uneasy. Emily was debating between chocolate and vanilla when James sensed a shift in atmosphere. A commotion near the playground caught his attention. A small figure was moving through the crowd, pointing and shouting something he couldn't quite make out. "She's my sister, my twin sister." The words finally reached him, clear and sharp, cutting through the park's noise. A young girl, no older than Emily, emerged from the crowd. Her clothes were tattered, her feet bare against the paved pathway. But what struck James wasn't her appearance. It was her face. The girl could have been Emily's reflection in a dirty mirror. The same golden hair, though tangled, the same delicate features, though smudged with dirt. Even their eyes matched, an unusual shade of green that James had always thought Emily inherited from her mother. Emily dropped her ice cream cone, frozen in place as she stared at her double. The strange girl moved closer, her eyes wide with recognition and something else. Hope, perhaps, or desperation. "I knew it. I knew I'd find you," the girl exclaimed, her voice trembling. "I've seen you in the newspapers with him." She pointed at James. "I kept telling everyone at St. Anne's that you looked just like me, but nobody believed me." James's mind raced. St. Anne's, the orphanage on the other side of town. He donated to their charity last Christmas, but had never visited. This had to be a scam, he told himself, an elaborate scheme to exploit his wealth. But then the girl pulled down the collar of her worn shirt, revealing a small birthmark on her left collarbone. James felt his blood run cold. Emily had the exact same mark in the exact same place, a detail that had never been published. "This is ridiculous," he managed to say, though his voice lacked conviction. "Emily, we're leaving." He reached for his daughter's hand, but Emily stayed rooted in place, her eyes fixed on the other girl. "Dad, wait," Emily whispered. "Look at her mark. It's just like mine." The crowd around them had grown, phones appearing to capture the scene. James could already imagine the headlines. Tech Mobile confronted by mysterious street child. His PR team would have a field day managing this crisis. But as he looked between the two girls, one in designer clothes, the other in rags, yet mirror images of each other, he felt something deeper than concern for his public image. A nagging doubt began to take root, accompanied by memories of the day Emily was born, the confusion in the delivery room, his wife's condition, the doctor's rushed explanations. "What's your name?" Emily asked the girl, her voice gentle and curious. "Clara," the girl replied, a slight tremor in her voice. "I've been looking for you for so long." James watched as his perfectly ordered world began to unravel. In all his years of building his tech empire, he had learned to trust his instincts. Right now, Those instincts told him this was more than a coincidence. A crowd had gathered, their whispers growing louder. Park security guards approached, probably alerted by concerned onlookers. James knew he had to take control of the situation before it spiraled further. But for the first time in years, he felt completely out of his depth. The two girls continued to stare at each other, seeming to communicate without words in a way that sent chills down James's spine. In that moment, standing in the middle of Central Park with his carefully constructed world threatening to collapse around him, he made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Mrs. Bennet, the Carter household's head housekeeper for the past 12 years, was arranging fresh flowers in the main hall when she heard the commotion at the front door. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing a sight that made her drop the crystal vase she was holding. It shattered on the marble floor, but she barely noticed. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Carter, looking more disheveled than she had ever seen him. Emily stood beside him, clutching his hand. But what caused Mrs. Bennet's shock was a third figure, a girl who could have been Emily's mirror image except for her worn clothes and untamed hair. Mrs. Bennet. James's voice carried an edge she had never heard before. Please prepare the guest room and find some clean clothes that might fit our visitor. The housekeeper's hands trembled as she bent to pick up the broken pieces of crystal. Her mind raced back to that night at the hospital, memories she had spent years trying to suppress. The confusion in the delivery ward, the whispered conversations, the sight of two bundles being whisked away in different directions. Right away, Mr. Carter, she managed to say, her voice barely steady. As she hurried up the grand staircase, she could hear Emily's excited chatter echoing through the foyer. You can stay in the room next to mine. It's painted blue, and you can see the garden from the windows. Do you like gardens, Clara? Clara? So that was the girl's name. Mrs. Bennet paused at the top of the stairs, watching as the strange child took in her surroundings with wide-eyed wonder. The chandelier's light caught her face at an angle that made the resemblance to Emily even more striking. In the kitchen, Mrs. Bennet found herself automatically preparing hot chocolate, Emily's favorite comfort drink. Her hands moved mechanically, while her mind wandered to that fateful night 10 years ago. She had been new to her position in the Carter household. Mrs. Carter had insisted she be present at the birth, saying she trusted her more than any relative. The delivery had been complicated. There had been a flurry of activity, doctors speaking in urgent whispers. Mrs. Carter had been heavily sedated, and Mr. Carter was away on business, trying desperately to reach the hospital in time. In the chaos, Mrs. Bennet had seen something, or thought she had seen something, that haunted her for years. 2 babies. She was certain there had been 2. But when she tried to ask questions, the medical staff had been dismissive. 1 baby, they insisted. Only 1. Mrs. Carter had been too weak to discuss anything, and within months she had passed away, taking any possibility of answers with her. Now, carrying a tray with 3 steaming mugs of hot chocolate, Mrs. Bennet descended the stairs. She found the unlikely trio in the library, where Clara was staring in awe at the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. I love reading, Clara was saying, her voice soft but eager. At St. Anne's, they let us use the library after homework. I've read every book they have, even the thick ones with tiny print, Clara said with a smile. I love reading too, Emily replied. Dad built this library for Mom. He keeps adding more books every year, even though... Her voice trailed off, her expression darkening for a moment. James sat in his leather armchair, his usual commanding presence somewhat diminished. He hadn't touched his phone once since arriving home, a first in Mrs. Bennet's memory. Instead, he watched the girls with an intensity that suggested his sharp mind was working overtime, processing possibilities he had never considered. Mrs. Bennet. He called out suddenly, making her jump. You were there, weren't you, the night Emily was born? The question she had dreaded for 10 years hung in the air. Mrs. Bennet set down the tray, buying herself a moment to steady her nerves. Both girls turned to look at her, their identical green eyes filled with curiosity. Yes, sir, she replied carefully. I was there. Tell me everything you remember, James demanded, then added more gently, please. Every detail could be important. Mrs. Bennet sank into a nearby chair, her legs suddenly weak. The girls gathered closer, sensing the importance of the moment. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows to the library's tall windows. In the golden light, the similarities between Emily and Clara seemed even more pronounced. As Mrs. Bennet began to speak, she felt the weight of a decade's silence lifting from her shoulders. But with that relief came a new anxiety. The truth, once spoken, could never be taken back. And this truth had the power to reshape not just the Carter family, but the lives of everyone connected to them. As Mrs. Bennet's story unfolded in the dimly lit library, James Carter felt his world shifting beneath his feet. Each word she spoke seemed to illuminate another piece of a puzzle he never knew existed. The housekeeper's voice trembled as she recounted the events of that fateful night, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The delivery room was chaotic, she continued, her eyes distant with remembrance. Mrs. Carter, Julia, was having complications. The doctors were speaking in hushed tones, moving quickly. I remember standing in the corner, trying to stay out of the way, but Julia had made me promise not to leave. Emily and Clara sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, their identical faces rapt with attention. The setting sun cast long shadows to the library windows, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that matched the weight of the moment. There was a moment, Mrs. Bennet said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, when I saw them. 2 nurses hurried past me, each carrying a bundle. I clearly remember thinking how strange it was that they were going in different directions, but when I tried to follow one of them, a doctor stopped me, saying I needed to stay with Julia. James leaned forward in his chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. Why didn't you tell me this before? Mrs. Bennet's eyes filled with tears. I tried, Mr. Carter. The day after, when you finally arrived at the hospital, I attempted to speak with you, but the doctors had already told you about the successful delivery of your daughter, and you were so relieved, so happy. Then when Julia's condition worsened, she didn't need to finish the sentence. James remembered those days all too well. His wife's rapid decline had consumed every thought, every moment. By the time Julia passed away 3 months later, the joy of Emily's birth had become inextricably tangled with the grief of losing his wife. There's more, Mrs. Bennet said, reaching into her apron pocket. She withdrew an aged envelope, its edges worn soft with time. Julia gave this to me the day before she left us. She made me promise to keep it safe, to give it to you when the time was right. I've carried it with me every day since then, waiting for a sign that it was time. James took the envelope with trembling hands. The paper was yellowed, and his name was written across the front in Julia's elegant handwriting. He stared at it for a long moment, memories of his wife's touch, her smile, her voice flooding back. Dad! Emily's gentle voice broke through his reverie. Aren't you going to open it? Clara remained silent, but her eyes were fixed on the envelope with an intensity that spoke volumes. James realized that this letter might hold answers not just for him, but for both these girls who shared his wife's features. With careful movements, he broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. Julia's familiar handwriting filled the page, though he could see places where tears had fallen, smudging the ink. My dearest James, he read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and I wasn't strong enough to tell you the truth myself. I've been having dreams, James. Dreams of 2 heartbeats, 2 sets of kicks. The doctors dismiss my concerns. Tell me I'm being paranoid, but a mother knows. He paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. There's something wrong here. The day of the delivery is mostly a blur, but I remember hearing 2 distinct cries. When I asked about it, they sedated me again. James, if I'm right, if my instincts are correct, you must promise me you'll find out the truth. Our family deserves to be whole. The letter continued, but James's voice failed him. Mrs. Bennet quietly took the paper from his hands and continued reading, her voice steady despite the tears rolling down her cheeks. I'm writing this because I feel myself growing weaker each day, and I'm afraid I won't have the strength to investigate myself. The doctors say it's just postpartum depression, but I know it's more than that. It's the weight of the secret, this terrible uncertainty that's crushing me. Emily had moved to sit on the arm of her father's chair, her small hand finding his. Clara remained where she was, but her posture had changed, becoming more rigid, as if bracing herself for what might come next. "I've left a trail," Mrs. Bennet read on, "in my blue jewelry box. There's a key to a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Inside, you'll find everything I managed to discover before I became too weak to continue. James, my love, if I'm wrong about all of this, then burn this letter and forget my paranoid ramblings. But if I'm right..." The letter ended there, the final words trailing off into a shaky line. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the ticking of the ancient grandfather clock in the corner and the distant sound of traffic beyond the mansion's walls. James finally looked up, his face set with determination. "Mrs. Bennet, where's Julia's jewelry box?" "In the master bedroom's walk-in closet, sir. Top shelf behind her winter scarves. She made me promise never to move it." He stood abruptly, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Emily, Clara, stay here with Mrs. Bennet. I need to..." He stopped, noticing the identical looks of protest forming on both girls' faces. "Please, Dad," Emily pleaded. "We deserve to know, too." Clara nodded in agreement, speaking up for the first time since Mrs. Bennet had begun her story. "She was my mother, too, if what we think is true." James looked between the two girls, seeing Julia in both their faces. How had he not noticed before? The way they both tilted their heads when asking a question, the same determined set of their jaws, all Julia's mannerisms perfectly replicated in two small bodies. The walk to the master bedroom felt longer than usual. Each step was weighed down with anticipation. James hadn't changed anything in this room since Julia's passing, preserving it like a museum to their shared life. Her perfume bottle still lined the vanity, her favorite book still stacked neatly on the bedside table. The girls followed close behind, their footsteps eerily synchronized on the hardwood floors. Mrs. Bennet brought up the rear, carrying the letter like a precious artifact. As James opened the closet door, the familiar scent of Julia's favorite lavender sachets wafted out, bringing with it a flood of memories. "The winter scarves," Mrs. Bennet reminded him gently, pointing to the highest shelf. James reached up, his fingers finding the soft wool of Julia's collection. Behind them, partially hidden in the shadows, sat a dusty blue box with silver filigree. His hands trembled slightly as he brought it down, remembering how Julia used to open it every evening to choose her jewelry for the next day. They gathered around the bed as he placed the box in the center of the cream-colored duvet. The key was exactly where Julia had said it would be, tucked into a small velvet pocket inside the lid. Along with it was a folded piece of paper with an account number written in Julia's handwriting. "First National Bank," James murmured, checking his watch. "It's nearly closing time." "I know the branch manager," Mrs. Bennet offered. "Laura Thompson. We grew up together. I could call her. Ask her to wait." James nodded gratefully, and Mrs. Bennet stepped into the hallway with her phone. Emily and Clara remained focused on the box, their expressions mirror images of curiosity and apprehension. "There's something else in here," Clara pointed out, reaching carefully into the box. She withdrew a small photo, its edges worn with age. It showed a much younger Julia, her stomach swollen with pregnancy, standing in what appeared to be a doctor's office. She was smiling at the camera, one hand resting protectively over her belly. "I've never seen this picture before," Emily whispered, leaning closer. James took the photo, studying it carefully. The date stamp in the corner caught his eye. It was from an appointment just 2 weeks before the delivery. But what made his breath catch was the ultrasound image partially visible on the screen behind Julia. Even to his untrained eye, there seemed to be more than one shape in the grainy image. Mrs. Bennet returned, slightly breathless. "Laura will wait. She says she can give us 15 minutes after closing, but no more. We need to go now." James decided, carefully replacing everything in the box except the key and bank information. "Mrs. Bennet, could you..." "I'll stay here with the girls," she began, but was immediately met with protest from both Emily and Clara. "No," they exclaimed in unison, then looked at each other in surprise at their synchronized response. "We're coming too," Emily insisted, her chin set in a way that was so reminiscent of Julia that it made James's heart ache. Clara nodded firmly. "Whatever's in that safety deposit box is about us. We have a right to be there." James looked at Mrs. Bennet, who gave a slight shrug. "They're right, sir. And they're certainly their mother's daughters, both of them. Julia would have wanted them there." The drive to the bank was tense with anticipation. James's driver navigated through the early evening traffic. While in the back seat, Emily and Clara sat on either side of him, their shoulders touching his arms. He noticed how they had unconsciously adopted the same posture, both with their hands clasped in their laps, both staring straight ahead. Mrs. Bennet sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at them in the rear-view mirror. James caught her eye once, and she gave him an encouraging nod. She had been Julia's confidant. He realized. All these years, she had carried this burden alone, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. As they pulled up to the bank, James saw a woman in a suit standing by the front door. Laura Thompson, he presumed. The bank's lights were dimmed, and the parking lot was empty except for a few employee vehicles. "Remember," he said softly to the girls, "whatever we find in that safety deposit box, we're in this together, all of us." They nodded solemnly, reaching for his hands as they walked toward the entrance. The setting sun cast long shadows across the bank's facade, and James couldn't help but feel that they were standing on the threshold of a moment that would change their lives forever. Laura Thompson greeted them with a warm but professional smile, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the two identical girls. She led them to the quiet bank, their footsteps echoing in the empty space toward the safety deposit box vault. As she input the security code and used her key, James clutched Julia's key tightly in his hand. In moments, they would unlock whatever secrets his wife had discovered in her final months. He looked down at the girls beside him, one in her expensive dress, the other in borrowed clothes, both wearing identical expressions of nervous anticipation, and silently promised Julia that he would make things right no matter what they discovered. The safety deposit box vault was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights humming overhead as Laura Thompson guided them to box number 2847. She inserted her master key, gesturing for James to use Julia's key simultaneously. The mechanism clicked softly, and the box slid out smoothly, carrying with it the weight of 10 years of secrets. "I'll give you privacy," Laura said softly, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she retreated to the vault's entrance. "Take as much time as you need, within reason." James placed a metal box on a nearby table, aware of Emily and Clara pressing close on either side of him. Mrs. Bennet stood slightly behind them, her hands clasped tightly together. With careful movements, he lifted the lid, revealing a stack of documents, photographs, and a sealed envelope with his name on it. Another letter from Julia. The first document he lifted out was a medical record, dated 3 months before the girl's birth. Julia's elegant handwriting covered the margins with notes and questions. She had circled certain phrases multiple times. Twin heartbeats detected. Recommend additional monitoring. "Look at this," Clara whispered, pointing to a grainy ultrasound image paper-clipped to the corner. Unlike the partial image they'd seen in the photo earlier, this one clearly showed 2 distinct shapes. James's hands trembled as he set aside the medical records and picked up a thin manila folder. Inside were what appeared to be private investigator reports, dated during Julia's final months. She had been looking into the hospital, specifically into a string of irregular adoptions that had taken place around the same time as the girl's birth. "Mom knew," Emily said softly, her voice filled with wonder and sadness. "She knew there were 2 of us." Clara remained silent, but her hand found Emily's, their fingers intertwining naturally. James watched the gesture, his heart constricting at this simple evidence of their connection, a connection that should have existed for the past 10 years. The next document made his blood run cold. It was a letter from a nurse who had been present during the delivery, written to Julia just weeks before her passing. The nurse expressed her guilt over what had happened, describing how the hospital's then director, Dr. Robert Harris, had orchestrated everything. He said one of the babies was too weak to survive. James read aloud, his voice tight with anger. He told the staff to inform us that only one child had survived, while the other was secretly transferred to St. Anne's orphanage. The nurse writes that she couldn't live with the guilt anymore, but by the time she sent this letter, Julia was too weak to act on the information. Mrs. Bennet finished quietly. She could barely lift her head in those final days. At the bottom of the box lay Julia's final letter, sealed in an envelope that bore small water stains. Her tears, James realized. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the pages within. "My dearest James," he began, then had to pause, collected himself before continuing. "And Emily and Clara, if you're reading this, then my suspicions were right, and you finally found each other. I fought so hard to stay, to see this moment, to make things right, but I feel my strength fading, and I know I won't be here to witness your reunion." The girls pressed closer as he continued reading. "James, my love, I know you'll blame yourself for not seeing the signs, for not investigating sooner. Don't. Focus your energy on healing our family, on giving our daughters a chance to know each other, to be sisters as they were always meant to be." Clara wiped tears from her cheeks, leaving streaks in a light layer of dirt that still clung to her face from her life on the streets. Emily immediately pulled a handkerchief from her dress pocket and handed it to her sister. The gesture was so natural, it seemed like they'd been doing it all their lives. "To my precious daughters," James's voice cracked as he read on. "I held you both, if only for a moment, before they took you away from me. I memorized your faces, your tiny fingers, the way you reached for each other even then. Emily, my bright morning star, and Clara, my sweet evening light. Those are the names I whispered to you in those brief seconds we shared." Mrs. Bennet gasped softly. That's why she insisted on naming her Emily. She wanted them to have the names she'd chosen together. "I don't know what circumstances you'll find each other in," Julia's letter continued, "but I know in my heart that you will find each other. The bond between twins is stronger than any force that might try to separate them. Emily, Clara, please forgive us for the years you've lost. Build new memories together. Take care of each other, and take care of your father. He'll need both of you more than he knows." The letter went on to detail trust funds that Julia had set up in both girls' names, and most importantly, the names of people who had been involved in the separation. Dr. Harris topped the list, followed by several nurses and administrators who had since left the hospital. "There's one more thing," James said, reaching into the box and withdrawing a small velvet pouch. Inside were 2 identical silver lockets, each engraved with one of the girls' names. When opened, they contained tiny photographs of Julia, smiling radiantly at the camera. "She never lost hope," Mrs. Bennet whispered, watching as James helped each girl fasten their locket around their neck. "She made sure there would be proof, that there would be a way for you to find the truth." The gravity of Julia's final gift settled over them like a blanket. In the sterile vault of First National Bank, surrounded by the evidence of a decade-old deception, a family was beginning to heal. But James knew this was just the beginning. There were still questions to be answered, people to be held accountable, and most importantly, a lifetime of lost moments to try to reclaim. The ride back to the Carter mansion was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, casting long shadows through the car windows. Clara sat with her head resting against the window, one hand absently touching the silver locket around her neck. Emily mirrored her position on the other side, their reflections in the darkening glass, creating an endless loop of identical faces. James's mind raced with everything they had discovered. The documents from the safety deposit box were secured in his briefcase, but Julia's words echoed in his thoughts. She had known, had fought to expose the truth even as her strength failed her. And now, 10 years later, her final gift to their family was a chance to make things right. As they pulled into the circular driveway of the mansion, Mrs. Bennet cleared her throat softly. "I've taken the liberty of calling Rosa to prepare a proper dinner. The girls need to eat, and we all have much to discuss." James nodded gratefully. In the chaos of the day's events, he'd forgotten basic necessities like food. Clara's eyes widened at the mention of dinner, and he was painfully reminded that her life at St. Anne's had likely been one of constant want. "First," he said as they entered the house, "Clara needs proper clothes. Emily, would you help your sister find something comfortable to wear?" The word sister felt strange on his tongue, but the bright smiles that lit up both girls' faces told him it was right. Emily immediately took Clara's hand, leading her toward the grand staircase. "My room has 2 closets," she was saying excitedly, "and I have so many clothes I never wear." "Oh, you can have my blue cashmere sweater. I always thought it was too big for me, but it would look perfect on you." "Sir," Mrs. Bennet said once the girls were out of earshot, "there are arrangements that need to be made, legal matters to consider." James ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling the weight of today's events. "Yes, I'll call Michael first thing in the morning. As my lawyer, he needs to know everything we discovered. We'll need to move quickly to establish Clara's identity, to secure her place in the family legally." "And what about Dr. Harris?" Mrs. Bennet asked, her voice hardening at the name. "The man responsible for all of this." "He'll be dealt with," James replied, a steel edge to his voice. "Julia had gathered enough evidence to destroy him. But first, we need to focus on Clara, on helping her adjust to this new life." From upstairs came the sound of girlish laughter, a duet of identical voices sharing some private joke. The sound brought an unexpected smile to James's face, even as tears pricked at his eyes. How many moments like this had been stolen from them? "Mrs. Bennet," he said suddenly, "I owe you an apology. You carried this burden alone for so long." She held up a hand, stopping him. "No apologies needed, sir. I made a promise to Julia, and now I fulfilled it. Seeing those girls together, hearing them laugh, that's all the reward I need." The sound of footsteps on the stairs drew their attention. Clara and Emily descended together. Clara now dressed in a simple blue sweater and jeans that could have come from any high-end department store. She had washed her face, and her hair had been neatly brushed, making the resemblance between the girls even more striking. "Dad," Emily called out, "Clara's never had sushi. Can we order from Nobu, please?" James felt a surge of emotion at the casual way Emily had included her sister in such a normal request. "Mrs. Bennet, would you ask Rosa to set an extra place at the table? And perhaps we could eat in the family room tonight. Make it more casual." The housekeeper nodded, understanding his intention to make Clara feel more comfortable. As she headed toward the kitchen, James turned to find both girls watching him with identical expressions of curiosity. "There's something else we need to discuss," he said, gesturing for them to follow him into his study. The room, with its dark wood paneling and leather furniture, had always been his sanctuary. Now, as the girls settled onto the leather sofa, it felt like it was becoming something more, a place for family discussions, for building new traditions. "Clara," he began carefully, "I want you to know that this is your home now. We'll need to handle some legal matters, but you are my daughter, and this is where you belong. However, I understand if you need time to adjust, to process everything that's happened today." Clara's fingers went to the locket around her neck, a gesture he was beginning to recognize as a self-soothing mechanism. "What about St. Anne's? Sister Catherine and the other girls?" "We'll visit them," Emily interjected quickly. "They're part of your family too, right? So they're kind of like my family now as well." James felt a surge of pride at his daughter's intuitive kindness. "We're not trying to erase your past, Clara. We're just hoping to give you the future you should have had all along." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes, but before James could move to comfort her, Emily had already wrapped her arms around her sister. The gesture was so natural, so right, that it took his breath away. In just hours, they had begun to forge a bond that had been denied them for so long. A soft knock at the door announced Mrs. Bennet's return. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, she said, smiling at the scene before her. "And Rosa's making her special chocolate souffle for dessert. With vanilla ice cream?" Both girls asked simultaneously, then burst into giggles at their synchronized response. "Of course," Mrs. Bennet replied, her eyes twinkling. Some things, it seems, run in the family. As James watched his daughters chatting excitedly about dessert, he felt a presence in the room that he hadn't experienced in years. Julia was here, he thought, in the way Emily crinkled her nose when she laughed, in the thoughtful tilt of Clara's head, in the perfect synchronicity of their movements. His wife had given them one final miracle, the chance to be whole again. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the blue guest room's windows, casting a gentle glow over Clara as she sat on the windowsill, wearing Emily's borrowed pajamas. She had barely slept, spending most of the night trying to convince herself that this wasn't all an elaborate dream. Her fingers traced the silver locket around her neck, the only tangible proof that yesterday had been real. A soft knock at the door made her turn. Emily stood there, already dressed in her school uniform, her hair neatly braided. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" Clara smiled at her sister. The words still felt strange and wonderful in her mind. "Not really. Everything feels so surreal." "I kept waking up to make sure you were still here," Emily admitted, crossing the room to sit beside her on the windowsill. "I was afraid you might disappear." The honest admission made Clara's throat tighten with emotion. "I used to dream about having a family," she confessed. "At St. Anne's, I would make up stories about my parents, about why they left me there. I never imagined that you already had a family looking for me." Emily reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Dad's been on the phone since dawn. I heard him talking to his lawyer about making everything official." A knock on the doorframe interrupted them. Mrs. Bennet stood there, carrying a tray laden with breakfast foods. "I thought you girls might like to eat up here this morning. Mr. Carter is still handling some urgent matters in his study." The smell of fresh pastries and hot chocolate made Clara's stomach rumble. At St. Anne's, breakfast had been a simple affair, usually just oatmeal or toast. The spread before her now looked like something from a magazine: croissants, fresh fruit, yogurt parfaits, and 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream. "I wasn't sure what you like," Mrs. Bennet said kindly, setting the tray on a small table. "So I brought a variety." "Everything looks amazing," Clara breathed, then added shyly, "At St. Anne's, Sister Margaret always said we should be grateful for whatever we received." A shadow crossed Mrs. Bennet's face. "Well, in this house, you're allowed to have preferences, to want things, to be yourself." Emily was already pulling Clara toward the table. "You have to try the chocolate croissants. Rosa makes them fresh every morning, and they're absolutely heavenly." As the girls settled in to eat, Mrs. Bennet busied herself laying out clothes on the freshly made bed. A selection from Emily's wardrobe that had been carefully chosen to fit Clara. Everything still had its tags on, being part of Emily's yet unworn collection. Mr. Carter called the school. She informed them as she worked. "Emily, you'll be staying home for a few days while we sort everything out. And Clara, we have an appointment later today with Dr. Patel. She's a family physician. Just a routine checkup." Clara paused mid-bite, anxiety flickering across her face. Emily immediately sensed her sister's distress. "Dr. Patel is really nice," she assured her. "She always gives out strawberry-flavored lollipops after checkups. And she has a golden retriever named Einstein who comes to the office with her." The mention of a dog brightened Clara's expression. "Really?" "At St. Anne's, there was a stray cat that would visit sometimes. We named her Duchess, and Sister Margaret let us feed her leftovers. We have space for pets here," Emily said excitedly. "Dad always said I could have one when I was ready for the responsibility, but I could never decide what kind. Maybe we could choose together." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices from downstairs. James's deep tone carried through the house, though his words were indistinct. Mrs. Bennet quickly moved to close the bedroom door, but not before they heard him say firmly, "No comment to the press. That's final." The girls exchanged worried glances. "The press?" Clara whispered, her hand instinctively going to her locket again. Mrs. Bennet sighed, turning to face them. "Your father is a well-known figure, girls. News of Clara's existence was bound to attract attention. But don't worry. Mr. Carter has experience handling the media. He'll make sure you're both protected." Emily nodded confidently. "Dad's really good at handling reporters. He never lets them bother me at school or take my picture without permission. But what if they want to know about St. Anne's?" Clara asked quietly, "About how I lived before?" "Then we'll handle it together," came James's voice from the doorway. He looked tired but determined, his usually immaculate suit slightly rumpled from what had clearly been a long morning of calls. Your story is yours to tell Clara, if and when you choose to tell it. He crossed the room to join them. Accepting the cup of coffee, Mrs. Bennet quickly poured from the carafe on the breakfast tray. I've spoken with Michael, my lawyer. He's already working on the legal documentation we'll need. And I've arranged for additional security for the house, and for when you girls eventually return to school. Will I go to Emily's school? Clara asked hesitantly. James sat down in a nearby armchair, his expression softening. Would you like to? It's a wonderful school, and they have an excellent program to help new students adjust. But if you prefer something else, we can look at other options. Clara glanced at Emily, who was watching her with barely contained hope. The idea of being separated from her newly found sister, even for school hours, made her chest tight. I want to stay with Emily, she said firmly. James smiled, and for a moment, Clara saw tears in his eyes. Then that's what we'll do. But first, we need to handle the immediate concerns. Dr. Patel will be here at 11, and later today, we'll need to visit St. Anne's to discuss the transition with Sister Margaret. The mention of Sister Margaret made Clara sit up straighter. The nun had been the closest thing to a mother she'd had for the past 10 years. Will she be angry? She asked in a small voice. No, sweetheart. James assured her quickly. I spoke with her this morning. She's overjoyed that you found your family. She just wants what's best for you. Emily suddenly jumped up, her face bright with inspiration. Dad, can we take Sister Margaret some of Rose's chocolate croissants? And maybe we could set up regular visits? Clara shouldn't have to say goodbye to everyone at St. Anne's just because she's coming home. The word home hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy. Home. She had a home now. A real one, with a family who wanted her. St. Anne's orphanage looked smaller somehow, Clara thought, as the Carter's car pulled up to familiar iron gates. The building that had been her entire world for 10 years now seemed diminished in the shadow of her new reality. Sister Margaret stood waiting on the front steps, her weathered face breaking into a warm smile as Clara stepped out car. My dear child, the nun said softly, opening her arms. Clara ran to her, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap and starch fabric. Or should I say Miss Carter now? I'll always be your Clara, too, she whispered, clinging tightly to the woman who had been her guardian for so long. When she pulled back, she saw tears in Sister Margaret's eyes. Emily approached cautiously, holding a large basket covered with a checkered cloth. We brought treats from our kitchen, she said shyly. Clara said you liked chocolate croissants. Sister Margaret looked between the two girls, marvel evident on her face. In all my years here, I knew there was something special about you, Clara. The way you would stare at family photographs, saying you felt like you belonged somewhere else. God works in mysterious ways, bringing you back to your family. James stepped forward, extending his hand. Sister Margaret, I can't thank you enough for taking care of Clara all these years. I want you to know that you'll always be welcome in our home. Inside the orphanage, news of Clara's arrival had spread quickly. Children pressed their faces against windows and peeked around corners, whispering excitedly. In the main office, Sister Margaret served tea while James's lawyer, Michael, explained the legal proceedings that would follow. Given the evidence Mrs. Carter collected, establishing Clara's identity will be straightforward, Michael explained, spreading documents across Sister Margaret's worn desk. The DNA test results from Dr. Patel's visit this morning are just a formality. The real challenge will be handling the press. They've been calling all morning, Sister Margaret confirmed, frowning. Try and get information about Clara's time here. We prepared a statement. James said firmly, a simple acknowledgement of a private family matter, requesting respect for the girl's privacy during this transition period. Anyone who presses beyond that will have to deal with my legal team. Outside the office, Clara and Emily sat on the worn wooden bench where Clara had spent countless hours reading. A few of the younger children had overcome their shyness and gathered around, fascinated by the identical girls in their matching outfits. Will you still visit us? 6-year-old Lily asked Clara, her lower lip trembling slightly. Of course I will, Clara assured her, pulling the little girl into a hug. And maybe sometimes you can all come visit me too. We have a huge garden, perfect for playing games, and a treehouse, Emily added enthusiastically. Dad built it when I was 7, but I never really used it much. It will be more fun with friends. The door to Sister Margaret's office opened, and James emerged with Michael and the nun. Girls, it's time to gather Clara's belongings. Sister Margaret has given permission for Emily to help you pack. Clara led the way to the dormitories she had shared with 5 other girls. Her bed, now stripped of its sheets, stood in the corner by the window. Underneath was a single cardboard box containing all her worldly possessions, a few worn books, some hand-me-down clothes, and a small collection of treasures she'd gathered over the years. Is this everything? Emily asked softly, looking at the meager collection. Clara nodded, picking up a small stone painted to look like a ladybug. Lily made this for my last birthday. She held up a frayed friendship bracelet, and this was from Anna before she was adopted last year. We'll make a special place for them in your new room, Emily promised. Every treasure has a story, Dad always says. These are part of your story. As they packed, other girls filtered into the dormitory to say goodbye. There were tears and hugs, promises to write and visit. Sister Margaret appeared with photo albums she had kept of Clara's time at St. Anne's. For your new family, she said, handing it to James, so they can see the wonderful girl we've had the privilege of knowing these past 10 years. In the car ride home, Clara sat quietly, the photo album open on her lap. Emily leaned against her, looking at pictures of a younger Clara at various orphanage events. Christmas pageants, summer picnics, award ceremonies from school. You won the spelling bee 3 years in a row? Emily asked, pointing to one photo. Clara nodded. Sister Margaret helped me practice. She said education was the key to a better future. She was right, James said from the front, catching their eyes in the rearview mirror. And now you'll have every educational opportunity available. Both of you will. As they pulled into the mansion's driveway, Clara noticed additional security personnel stationed at the gates. A few photographers had gathered across the street, but the car's tinted windows and the vigilant security team kept them at a safe distance. Home sweet home, Emily announced as they entered the house. Now we can finally start making your room exactly how you want it. Dad says we can redecorate everything. Mrs. Bennet met them in the foyer, her face concerned. Mr. Carter, there's something you need to see. She handed him a tablet displaying a news website. James's expression darkened as he read. What is it, Dad? Emily asked, but Clara had already glimpsed a headline over his shoulder. Hospital director denies allegations of separated twins. Claims Carter family situation a misunderstanding. James quickly handed the tablet back to Mrs. Bennet. Nothing for you girls to worry about. Why don't you go up and start planning Clara's room? I believe Rosa mentioned something about fresh cookies in the kitchen, too. As the girls headed upstairs, Clara couldn't help but overhear James's quiet words to Mrs. Bennet. Get Michael back here. If Harris wanted to play this game, he's about to learn what happens when you mess with my family. Emily squeezed her hand, drawing her attention back. Come on, she said brightly. I have some interior design magazines we can look through. What's your favorite color? Clara smiled, pushing away her worries about headlines and hospital directors. Blue, she said firmly, like our room at St. Anne's. Sister Margaret always said it was the color of hope. The following morning, James sat in his home office, surrounded by stacks of documents and multiple screens displaying news coverage of a situation. Michael paced the room, phone pressed his ear, while Mrs. Bennet served fresh coffee and occasionally glanced worriedly at the security feeds, showing the growing media presence outside the gates. This is unacceptable, Michael said firmly into his phone. Dr. Harris's statement isn't just misleading. It's a direct attempt to discredit our evidence. He paused, listening. No, we're not interested in a private meeting. Any discussions will take place with all parties' legal representatives present. James rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. The morning papers had run Dr. Harris's statement as their leading story, casting doubt on Julia's evidence and suggesting that Clara's resemblance to Emily was merely a remarkable coincidence. Some outlets had even hinted that James might be the victim of an elaborate scam. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Emily and Clara stood in the doorway, still in their pajamas, their matching faces concerned. "Dad," Emily ventured. "We saw the news on my tablet." "Girls, you shouldn't be worrying about this," James began, but Clara stepped forward, her chin raised in a gesture that reminded him startlingly of Julia. "It's our story, too," she said quietly but firmly. "We deserve to know what's happening." Michael ended his call and exchanged glances with James, who nodded slowly. "You're right," he acknowledged, gesturing for the girls to come in. They settled on a leather sofa, shoulders touching as Mrs. Bennet discreetly closed the door. "Dr. Harris is trying to protect himself," James explained carefully. "He's afraid of what might happen if people discover he was involved in separating you two. But we have your mother's evidence, and now we have the DNA results from Dr. Patel confirming you're identical twins. So, why doesn't he just admit what he did?" Emily asked, frowning. "Because it's not just about you two anymore," Michael interjected gently. "If Dr. Harris admits to being involved in your separation, it could lead to investigations into other possible cases. His entire career, his reputation, everything would be at risk." Clara's hand went to her locket, a gesture that James was beginning to recognize as her way of finding courage. "Are there other children like me? Other families that were separated?" The question hung heavy in the air. It was something James had been wondering himself since discovering Julia's research. The private investigators' reports had hinted at other irregular adoptions during Harris's tenure as hospital director. "We don't know," he answered honestly. "But if there are, we'll find them. That's a promise." A knock at the door announced Rosa carrying a breakfast tray. "The girls haven't eaten yet," she explained, setting up plates of French toast and fresh fruit. "And growing children need their breakfast, no matter what's happening in the news." The normalcy of the moment, sharing breakfast in his office while discussing such extraordinary circumstances, struck James as surreal. Yet watching his daughters eat together, finishing each other's sentences and sharing knowing looks, he felt a profound sense of rightness beneath all the chaos. "Dad," Emily said suddenly, "I have an idea. What if we told our story first, before Dr. Harris and the newspapers make up their own version?" Clara nodded enthusiastically. "We could talk about how we found each other, show people Mom's evidence. Maybe if everyone knows the truth, other families will come forward too." Michael straightened in his chair. "It's not a bad idea, actually. Controlling the narrative would give us a significant advantage. We could do an exclusive interview with a respected journalist, someone who would handle the story with appropriate sensitivity." James looked at his daughters, seeing the determination in their identical faces. They were so young to be dealing with such complex situations, yet they were showing remarkable strength and wisdom. Julia would have been proud. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it as a family. No separate interviews, no sensational headlines, just the truth told in our own words." Mrs. Bennet, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "I know someone who might be perfect. Eleanor Harper from the Sunday Times. She's known for her investigative work in family justice cases, and she has a reputation for being thorough but compassionate." "I remember her," James nodded. "She did that series on adoption reform last year. But girls, are you sure you're ready for this? Once we go public with the full story, there's no going back." The twins exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications they seemed to have mastered in their short time together. "We're sure," they said in unison. Michael was already pulling out his phone. "I'll have my team draft a formal statement and reach out to Ms. Harper. We'll need to move quickly before Harris can spin this any further. And I'll have Rosa prepare something special for dinner," Mrs. Bennet added. "The girls will need their strength for what's coming." As the adults began making arrangements, Clara and Emily remained on the sofa, their breakfast forgotten. Clara leaned her head on her sister's shoulder, a gesture that had become natural over the past few days. "Are you scared?" she whispered. "A little," Emily admitted. "But we have each other now. And we have Dad and Mrs. Bennet and everyone else who loves us. We're stronger together." Looking at them, James felt a fierce surge of protective love. They were right. This was their story to tell. and he would make sure they had every support, every protection, every advantage in telling it. Harris and his allies were about to learn that the Carter family was not to be underestimated. Catherine Bennett sat in the Carter Mansion's sunlit conservatory, her recorder placed carefully on the table between them. She had arrived early that morning, taking an enhanced security presence, and the small group of photographers still camped outside the gates. But here in this peaceful space, surrounded by Julia Carter's carefully tended orchids, the outside world seemed distant. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," James said, his daughter seated on either side of him on the antique sofa. "We appreciate your reputation for handling sensitive stories with discretion." Catherine nodded, her experienced eyes taking in the scene before her. The girls were dressed similarly but not identically. Emily in a pale blue dress, Clara in cream-colored slacks and a matching blouse. Their hands were clasped together, drawing strength from each other. "Before we begin," Catherine said gently, "I want you all to understand that we can stop at any time. This is your story to tell, and we'll tell it on your terms." Mrs. Bennett served tea and freshly baked cookies, hovering protectively nearby as the interview began. Catherine started with the basics. The Chan encounter in the park, the immediate recognition of their similarities, the discovery of Julia's hidden evidence. "Clara," Catherine asked carefully, "can you tell me about the moment you first saw Emily in the newspaper?" Clara's fingers went to her locket, but her voice was steady. "It was during last year's technology conference. Dad, Mr. Carter, was on the cover of the Business Weekly, and Emily was in one of the photos with him. I kept the magazine hidden under my mattress at St. Anne's. Sometimes at night, I'd look at it and wonder why someone who looked so much like me lived such a different life." Emily squeezed her sister's hand. "And I always felt like something was missing," she added. "Dad used to find me looking through Mom's old photos for hours, like I was searching for something I couldn't name." Catherine turned to James. "When did you first begin to suspect that Julia's concerns might be valid?" "The moment I saw Clara's birthmark," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Identical placement, identical shape. But it was Julia's letter that confirmed everything. She knew. Somehow she knew what had happened. She spent her final months gathering evidence, preparing for the day when the truth would come out." The interview continued, moving through the events of the past week. Catherine listened intently as they described the discoveries in the safety deposit box, the DNA confirmation, and Dr. Harris's attempts to discredit their story. "Mrs. Bennett," Catherine called to the housekeeper who had remained nearby. "Would you be willing to share your perspective? You were present at the hospital that day." Mrs. Bennett stepped forward, smoothing her apron nervously. "I saw 2 babies," she said firmly. "I've carried that knowledge for 10 years, wondering if I should have spoken up sooner. Julia knew something was wrong. She could feel it, but by the time she had proof, she was too weak to fight anymore." Catherine's questions were thorough but gentle, allowing each person to tell their part of the story in their own way. When she asked about Dr. Harris's recent statements, James's expression hardened. "He's trying to protect himself at the expense of my daughters," he said. "But Julia left us irrefutable evidence. The DNA tests confirm what we already knew in our hearts. Clara and Emily are twins, separated at birth through his actions. And what do you hope will come from sharing your story?" Catherine asked, directing the question to the girls. The twins exchanged glances before Clara spoke. "We want other families to know the truth. Maybe there are more children out there like me, wondering why they feel incomplete. They deserve to find their families too." Emily nodded. "And we want to finish what Mom started. She fought so hard to expose the truth. We need to be brave like she was." As the interview drew to a close, Catherine turned off her recorder and sat back, visibly moved by what she had heard. "This is more than just a story about separated twins," she said thoughtfully. "It's about a mother's love reaching beyond her time, about sisters finding each other against impossible odds, about truth prevailing over deception." "When will the article be published?" James asked, his arm around both girls. "Sunday's edition," Catherine replied. "I'll send you a draft or review first, of course. And I promise you, this story will be told with all the dignity and respect it deserves." After Catherine left, the family remained in the conservatory, The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the orchids, creating patterns on the tile floor. Mrs. Bennet brought fresh tea and sat with them, all of them processing the emotional weight of sharing their story. "Do you think it will make a difference?" Clara asked quietly. "Telling everyone what happened?" James pulled both girls closer. "Your mother believed that the truth always finds its way into the light. She trusted that when it did, it would help not just our family, but others too. And she was right. She's still right." Emily rested her head on his shoulder. "I wish she could see us now, all of us together." "She can," Mrs. Bennet said softly, looking at the orchids Julia had so lovingly tended. Mothers always find a way to watch over their children. As if in response to her words, a gentle breeze stirred the flowers, carried with the faintest scent of Julia's favorite perfume. The twins smiled at each other, their free hands touching their lockets in perfect synchronization. The story would break on Sunday, and with it would come new challenges, new scrutiny, new battles to face. But in that moment, surrounded by Julia's flowers and wrapped in the love of their growing family, they were ready for whatever came next. Sunday morning arrived with an unusual stillness over the Carter mansion. James sat in his study, the advanced copy of the Sunday Times spread before him on his desk. Eleanor Harper's article occupied the entire front page, accompanied by a carefully chosen photograph of the twins sitting in the conservatory, surrounded by Julia's orchids. The headline read, "A Mother's Final Gift, The Untold Story of the Carter Twins." The article was everything they had hoped for: compassionate, thorough, and undeniably powerful. Eleanor had woven together Julia's evidence, the hospital records, and the family's personal narrative into a compelling exposé that left no room for doubt about the truth of their story. Mrs. Bennet appeared at the door, her face tense. "You might want to see this." She handed him her tablet. Open to a breaking news alert. Dr. Harris had called an emergency press conference at the hospital. The live stream showed him standing at a podium, his usual confidence notably absent as he faced a barrage of questions from reporters. "I need to wake the girls," James said, rising from his desk. "They should hear whatever he has to say." But when he reached the hallway between their rooms, he found both doors open. Emily and Clara were awake, huddled together on Clara's window seat with Emily's tablet between them, watching the same live stream. "Dad," Emily called out softly, making room for him to join them. He looked scared. On the screen, Dr. Harris cleared his throat, his hands visibly shaking as he adjusted his microphone. "In light of recent revelations and after careful consideration, I feel compelled to address the allegations made in today's Sunday Times." Clara leaned closer to the screen, her hand automatically finding her sister's. They watched as the man responsible for their separation began to crack under the pressure of truth. "While I maintain that all actions taken at this hospital were intended to be in the best interest of our patients," Harris continued, his voice strained, "I acknowledge that serious errors in judgment may have occurred during my tenure as director." "May have occurred," James muttered, but the girls shushed him, intent on hearing more. "The case of the Carter twins has brought to light certain irregularities in our past procedures. I am announcing my immediate resignation as hospital director and my full cooperation with any investigations into these matters." The press room erupted into chaos, reporters shouting questions as Harris visibly wilted under the onslaught. But one voice cut through the noise, clear and sharp. "Dr. Harris, are there other cases? Other families who were separated?" The former director's face went pale. Before his aide could usher him away from the podium, he uttered 7 words that would change everything. "There may have been similar situations." "Yes." Mrs. Bennet appeared in the doorway, holding a cordless phone. "Mr. Carter, Michael is on the line. He says the hospital's board of directors is calling an emergency meeting. They want you to attend." James looked at his daughters, seeing the mixture of emotions playing across their identical faces. "Girls, I need to handle this. Mrs. Bennet will stay with you, and I'll have extra security." "We want to come," they said in unison. "This isn't just about us anymore," Clara added quietly. Emily nodded. "If there are other families like ours, they need to know they're not alone. Mom would want us to help them." James felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. His daughters were showing remarkable strength and maturity, but they were still so young to be dealing with such heavy issues. Let me talk to Michael first. He compromised. We'll figure out the best way to handle this. Sister Margaret greeted them at the entrance, her kind face showing signs of both hope and worry. "Thank you for coming," she said warmly. "Emma and Mrs. Chun are waiting in my office. I should warn you, Emma's gotten quite excited about the possibility of answers, despite our attempts to manage her expectations." Inside the office, they found a scene that struck them all with its familiar elements. A girl about their age sat next to a tired-looking woman, both of them clutching hands just as Emily and Clara often did. Emma looked up as they entered, and her eyes immediately locked onto the twins. "Oh my God," she whispered, her free hand flying to her mouth. Mrs. Chin looked confused until Sister Margaret gently explained, "These are the Carter twins. Their case was the one that opened the investigation into the hospital's practices. We read about you," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "Your story. It gave me hope that maybe I wasn't imagining things all these years." Emily and Clara moved closer, sitting down nearby while James and Michael began discussing the technical aspects with Mrs. Chun and Sister Margaret. The three girls formed their own quiet bubble conversation. "You felt it too, didn't you?" Emily asked softly. That feeling that something was missing. Emma nodded vigorously. "All my life. Mom said she could feel 2 heartbeats when she was pregnant, but the doctors insisted she was wrong. They said the medication they gave her during delivery must have confused her." "The same medication they gave our mom," Clara noted, exchanging significant glances with her sister. While the girls talked, the adults were reviewing records. Michael had brought copies of Julia's research, and Sister Margaret had pulled Emma's placement files. The parallels were becoming increasingly clear. "The dates align perfectly," Michael was saying, laying out documents side by side. "The same hospital, many of the same staff members involved, and the same pattern of dismissing the mother's concerns about multiple heartbeats." Mrs. Chun, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "There was a nurse," she said, her voice distant with memory. "She tried to tell me something the day after delivery, but then Dr. Harris came in and sent her away. I never saw her again." "The same thing happened with our mother," James said gently. Julia documented similar experiences from other mothers in her research. Sister Margaret pulled out another file, her hands trembling slightly. "There's something else you should see. A girl was brought to St. Vincent's home in Rhode Island on the same day Emma came to us. The paperwork, it's remarkably similar." A charged silence fell over the room. Emma's grip on her mother's hand tightened visibly. "St. Vincent's?" Michael asked, already pulling out his phone. "We can have someone there within hours to begin checking records." "I have the file here," Sister Margaret said, passing over a thick folder. "We maintain connections with other homes in the region, sharing information when children might have siblings in different locations. It's standard practice, but in this case..." James watched as his daughters moved closer to Emma, offering silent support as the adults discussed the possibilities before them. The three girls sat together, united by their shared experience of feeling incomplete for so long. "What happens now?" Emma asked, her voice small but hopeful. Emily reached for her hand. "Now we investigate, just like Mom did for us. We follow every lead, check every record until we find the truth. And we stay with you through all of it," Clara added firmly. "You're not alone anymore." Mrs. Chin wiped tears from her eyes, watching the interaction. "All these years, people told me I was being paranoid, that I needed to accept things as they were. But a mother knows. In her heart, a mother always knows." James thought of Julia, of her unwavering certainty and determination. She had known that her discovery would lead to others, that her fight for truth would extend beyond their own family. Looking at his daughters now, offering comfort and hope to another family beginning their journey of discovery, he saw Julia's legacy living on in the most beautiful way possible. The conference room at the Julia Carter Foundation's Boston office had been transformed into a command center. Maps, documents, and photographs covered the walls, while laptops displayed various database searches. In the center of this organized chaos, Emily and Clara sat with Emma, all three girls intently studying the records from St. Vincent's home. "Look at this," Emma said, pointing to a document. "The intake officer who processed my paperwork also signed these forms at St. Vincent's, just like how the social worker handled both our cases," Clara noted, sharing a meaningful look with Emily. James watched from the doorway as the girls worked. They had developed an impressive system over the past few days, applying the investigative techniques they'd learned from Julia's notes to Emma's case. Their dedication was touching, but he worried they might be too emotionally invested. "Girls," he called softly, entering the room. "Rosa just delivered lunch. Why don't you take a break?" "But, Dad," Emily protested, "we're so close. The girl at St. Vincent's, her name is Grace, and she was brought in on the exact same day as Emma. And look at her intake photo," Clara added, holding up a grainy photograph. "She has the same distinctive birthmark as Emma, just like Emily and I have matching marks." James moved closer to examine the photograph. Indeed, there was a small crescent-shaped mark visible on Grace's shoulder, identical to the one he'd noticed on Emma during their meeting at St. Catherine's home. "Michael is already at St. Vincent's," he reminded them gently. "He'll verify everything in person. For now, you need to eat and rest." Mrs. Bennet appeared with a tray of sandwiches and fresh fruit. "Your father's right. Even detectives need lunch breaks." The girls reluctantly stepped away from their work, but their conversation over lunch remained focused on the case. "Emma," Clara asked carefully, "how are you feeling about all this? About possibly having a twin sister?" Emma played with her sandwich, her expression thoughtful. "It's overwhelming, but in a good way. All my life, I've had this feeling that something was missing. Watching you two together, seeing how you finish each other's thoughts and just understand each other without words, it makes me hope that maybe I could have that too." "You will," Emily said confidently. "Once we find Grace," James interjected gently, "we need to be careful about making promises. There's still more investigation to be done." But even as he urged caution, his phone buzzed with a message from Michael. The lawyer had made significant progress at St. Vincent's, discovering more connections between the two cases. The same doctor who had handled Emma's birth had signed off on Grace's placement paperwork. The same unusual medications had been administered to both mothers during delivery. "Dad," Emily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Your phone kept buzzing. "Is it news from Mr. Carter?" James looked at the eager faces before him, remembering how it felt when they were uncovering the truth about Clara. "He's found some promising leads," he admitted, "but we need to verify everything before taking next steps. Could we maybe look for a recent picture of Grace?" Emma asked hesitantly. "Just to—" The girls turned to James with pleading expressions that reminded him so much of Julia. It made his heart ache. How many times had she looked at him that same way, asking him to believe in seemingly impossible things? "All right," he conceded, "but let's be methodical about this. What would your mother's note suggest as the next step?" The twins exchanged excited glances before Emily grabbed Julia's research notebook. "Mom always said to follow the paper trail first," she recited. "Look for patterns in dates, names, and locations." Clara nodded, already pulling up a database on her laptop, and cross-reference everything with hospital records from that period. Emma watched them work with a mixture of awe and hope. "Your mom really thought of everything, didn't she?" "She knew the truth would come out eventually," James said softly. "She just wanted to make sure there was a clear path to follow when it did." As the afternoon progressed, more pieces began falling into place. Michael sent regular updates from St. Vincent's, each one adding weight to their theory. Grace had been placed in a home under circumstances remarkably similar to Clara's placement at St. Anne's. The same vague explanations, the same rushed paperwork, the same pattern of dismissed concerns. "Mr. Carter," Mrs. Bennet appeared at the door. "Mrs. Chun is here. She says she has something important to share." Rebecca Chun entered the conference room, clutching an old shoebox. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it on the table. "I've kept these all these years," she said, removing the lid to reveal a collection of hospital papers, photographs, and diary entries. "After Emma was born, I started documenting everything, just like your wife did. I thought people would say I was crazy, so I kept it hidden. But when I read about your case, Emma moved to her mother's side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. The gesture reminded James of how Emily and Clara often comforted each other. I heard 2 distinct cries. Mrs. Chin continued, her voice thick with emotion, before they gave me the medication that made everything fuzzy. And later, when I tried to ask questions, Dr. Harris said the same things he told your wife, that I was confused that the medication had affected my memory. James began carefully examining the document from a box, his experienced eyes catching details that others might miss. The similarities to Julia's case were striking, not just in the medical records, but in the way both mothers had fought to preserve the truth they knew in their hearts. Mum, Emma whispered, hugging her mother tighter. Why didn't you tell me about all this? I didn't want to burden you with what I couldn't prove, Mrs. Chin replied. But when I saw the article about the Carter twins, when I read about Julia's investigation, I knew it was time to bring these out of hiding. The girls had gathered around the box, carefully examining its contents with the reverence of archaeologists uncovering ancient treasures. Each document they found seemed to strengthen the connection between Emma and Grace's cases. Dad, Emily said suddenly, holding up a photograph. Look at this. It was a delivery room photo taken moments after Emma's birth. In the background, partially visible through a doorway, was a second bassinet being wheeled away by a nurse, the same nurse who appeared in Julia's documentation of other cases. James felt a familiar surge of emotion, the same feeling he'd experienced when they first discovered the truth about Clara. History was repeating itself. But this time, they had the tools and knowledge to help another family find their way back together. The following morning brought news that would change everything. Michael arrived at the Foundation's office early, his expression a mixture of excitement and caution as he called everyone into the conference room. I've just finished speaking with Sister Angela at St. Vincent's, he announced, spreading photographs across the table. Grace has been living in Providence, Rhode Island, less than 2 hours from here. And there's more. She's been experiencing the same inexplicable feelings of connection that Emma described. Emma, who had been staying with the Carters during the investigation, leaned forward to examine the most recent photograph of Grace. The resemblance was undeniable. The same heart-shaped face, the same distinctive amber eyes that had caught everyone's attention in Emma's intake photos. She looks just like me, Emma whispered, her fingers tracing the outline of Grace's face in the photograph. Even the way she tilts her head when she smiles. Grace has agreed to meet, Michael continued, watching Emma carefully. Sister Angela explained our investigation to her and her foster family. They're willing to come to Boston this afternoon. The room erupted in excited chatter, but James noticed Emily and Clara exchange knowing looks. They understood better than anyone the complex emotions that came with such a meeting. Emily said gently, would you like us to help you prepare? We remember how overwhelming our meeting was. Emma nodded gratefully, her eyes never leaving Grace's photograph. What do I say to her? How do I explain that I felt her absence my whole life without sounding crazy? You don't have to explain that part, Clara assured her. If she's your twin, she'll understand without words. We did. Mrs. Bennet, ever practical, began organizing the details. We should use the small conference room for the meeting. It's more intimate. And I'll have Rosa prepare a selection of snacks. Having something to focus on can help ease the tension. As the adults discussed logistics, the 3 girls retreated to their corner of the office. Emily and Clara shared their experience of first meeting, while Emma listened intently, occasionally touching the photograph as if to reassure herself that it was real. The hardest part, Emily explained, was holding back all the questions we had. We wanted to know everything about each other right away. Clara nodded in agreement, but then we realized we had time. We didn't have to squeeze a lifetime into one meeting. Did you feel it right away? Emma asked. The connection? The twins shared another look before Emily answered. Yes, but it was overwhelming at first. Like suddenly having access to a part of yourself you didn't know was missing. The hours leading up to the meeting passed in a blur of preparation. Emma alternated between nervous excitement and quiet contemplation, while Mrs. Chin sat nearby, holding her daughter's hand and sharing meaningful glances with James. They both understood the weight of this moment, the potential for healing and the risk of reopened wounds. Finally, Michael's phone buzzed with a message. "They're here," he announced softly. The Foundation security team had arranged for Grace and her foster family to enter through a private entrance, avoiding the media that had begun gathering outside since news of another potential case had leaked. Emma stood as the conference room door opened, her mother's hand tight in hers. Emily and Clara moved closer, offering silent support on either side. The girl who entered could have been Emma's reflection. She had the same amber eyes, the same nervous habit of tucking hair behind her ear. For a moment, the two girls simply stared at each other, recognition and wonder playing across their identical faces. "Hi," Grace said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm Grace." "Emma," came the equally soft reply. They moved toward each other slowly, as if drawn by an invisible force. When they were close enough to touch, both girls reached out simultaneously, their hands meeting in the middle. "You have it too," Grace whispered, pushing up her sleeve to reveal the crescent-shaped birthmark on her shoulder. Emma nodded, showing her matching mark. "I used to think I was the only one who felt like this, like I was somehow incomplete. Like there was an echo where something else should be," Grace finished, tears filling her eyes. Their foster parents and Mrs. Chin watched from opposite sides of the room as the girls began to talk, their words tumbling out faster and faster as they discovered shared traits, similar interests, and parallel experiences. James moved to stand beside Mrs. Chun, who was watching the scene with tears streaming down her face. "They found each other," she said softly. "After all these years, they finally found each other." Emily and Clara sat nearby, their own hands clasped together as they witnessed another pair of sisters beginning their journey of reconnection. They had helped make this moment possible, using their own experience and their mother's guidance to light the way for others. "Dad," Emily said quietly, "do you think there are more? More families out there waiting to be reunited?" James looked at his daughters, seeing Julia's determination shining in their eyes. "If there are, we'll find them. That's what your mother would have wanted." As they watched Emma and Grace continue to discover each other, their connection growing stronger with each passing moment, James felt Julia's presence more strongly than ever. She had known that exposing the truth about their family would create ripples of hope for others. Now, watching those ripples spread, he understood that her legacy would reach far beyond anything they had initially imagined. The days following Emma and Grace's reunion brought a flood of new developments. The Julia Carter Foundation hotline was overwhelmed with calls from families who had seen the media coverage of their story. Each call seemed to reveal another piece of the puzzle that Julia had begun to assemble years ago. James sat in his office, reviewing the latest batch of reports with Michael, while Emily, Clara, Emma, and Grace worked at their designated corner, now expanded to accommodate the two additional investigators in training. The girls had formed an immediate bond, united by their shared experiences and determination to help others. "Look at this pattern," Emily said, spreading out a series of documents. "All these cases happened within a 5-year period, all at hospitals where Dr. Harris had connections." Clara nodded, adding another file to the growing collection. "And they all involved families with similar profiles, one parent with significant resources, and children who ended up in specific orphanages." "Just like us," Grace added softly, exchanging glances with Emma. The two had barely left each other's side since their first meeting, making up for lost time with an intensity that reminded James of Emily and Clara's early days together. Mrs. Bennett entered the office carrying a tray of afternoon snacks, pausing to observe the scene before her. "Julia would be so proud," she said quietly to James. "Not just of the girls, but of how her work has grown beyond anything we imagined." Indeed, the foundation had evolved rapidly. What started as a personal mission to help the Carter family had become a beacon of hope for dozens of potentially affected families. The wall of their main office now featured a carefully mapped network of connections, each thread representing a possible case that needed investigation. "Mr. Carter?" The intercom buzzed with his assistant's voice. Eleanor Harper is here for your meeting. The journalist had become an invaluable ally in their investigation, using her resources and connections to help verify leads and bring attention to the growing number of cases. She entered the office with her characteristic energy, carrying a thick folder of new information. "You're going to want to see this," she said, spreading photographs across James's desk. These came from a former nurse who worked with Harris at 3 different hospitals. She's been keeping records of everything she witnessed, waiting for the right moment to come forward. The photographs showed delivery rooms, nurseries, and hospital corridors from various facilities where Harris had worked. In several images, the same faces appeared repeatedly, staff members who had moved with him from hospital to hospital. It wasn't just one hospital, Eleanor explained. It was a network. Harris and his team would rotate through different facilities, implementing the same practices wherever they went. Emma and Grace had moved closer to listen, their expressions serious. Like Emily and Clara, they had become deeply invested in understanding the full scope of what had happened to their family and others. "That's her," Emma said suddenly, pointing to the nurse in one of the photos. "She was there the day I was born. Mom recognized her in the delivery room photo we found." James studied the image carefully. "Michael, we need to find this nurse. If she was part of Harris's inner circle, she might have information about other cases." "Already on it," Michael replied, typing rapidly on his laptop. "Her name is Margaret Wheeler. She left the medical field shortly after Harris's resignation and moved to Florida. I want to interview her," Clara said firmly, Emily nodding in agreement beside her. James started to protest, but Eleanor interrupted gently. "Actually, that might not be a bad idea. These girls have a unique perspective on the situation. They know what questions to ask because they've lived it. We could go as a team," Emily suggested. "Clara and I have experience with these interviews now, and Emma and Grace could share their story too. It might help Mrs. Wheeler understand why this is so important." The adults exchanged glances, considering the proposal. The girls had proven themselves remarkably capable and insightful in their investigation work. "We need to be careful," Michael cautioned. "Margaret Wheeler might not be willing to talk, especially if she was deeply involved in Harris's activities." "But she kept these records," Grace pointed out, gesturing to the photographs. "That must mean part of her wanted the truth to come out eventually." Mrs. Bennett, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Perhaps seeing these girls, living proof of what was done, might be exactly what she needs to finally tell her story." James looked at the 4 girls, seeing in their faces the same determination that had driven Julia in her research. They had taken up her mission with a passion that went beyond simple curiosity or justice. For them, this was about healing not just their own families, but potentially dozens of others who might be searching for their missing pieces. "We'll make arrangements," he decided, "but we do this carefully, professionally, no promises or accusations. We're just there to listen and learn." The girls broke into excited discussion, already planning their approach to the interview. James watched them work, struck by how naturally they had fallen into their roles as investigators. Emma and Grace had brought new energy and perspective to the team, while Emily and Clara had become mentors of sorts, sharing what they had learned from their own journey. Eleanor began organizing her notes, a slight smile playing on her lips. "You know," she said to James, "when I first covered your family story, I thought it was extraordinary. Now I realize it was just the beginning of something much bigger." "Julia knew," James replied softly, watching the girls huddle together over their research. "Somehow, she knew that bringing our family's truth to light would help others find their way home too." The Florida sun beat down on a rental car as it wound through a quiet residential neighborhood in Tampa. James glanced in the rearview mirror at the 4 girls in the back seat, all wearing matching Julia Carter Foundation polo shirts. Their idea of presenting a professional image for the interview. "Remember," Michael reminded them from the passenger seat, "Mrs. Wheeler agreed to speak with us, but she's understandably nervous. We need to be patient and respectful." The house they pulled up to was modest, with well-tended flower beds and a small American flag by the door. Margaret Wheeler had agreed to meet them after weeks of careful communication through her lawyer, but the tension was palpable as they approached the front door. A woman in her 60s opened the door before they could knock. Her hair was silver, her face lined with age and worry, but her eyes were sharp as they took in the group before her, particularly the two sets of identical twins. "You must be the Carter girls," she said softly, her gaze moving between Emily and Clara. "And you're Emma and Grace. I remember the day you were born." The admission hung in the air for a moment before Mrs. Wheeler stepped back, inviting them inside. The living room was neat and comfortable, with photographs covering the walls, mostly of landscapes and flowers, James noticed, but no family pictures. "I've been following your foundation's work," Mrs. Wheeler said as they settled into seats. "When I saw the article about the Carter twins, I knew it was only a matter of time before more cases came to light." "Is that why you kept records?" Clara asked gently, pulling out her notebook, a habit she developed during their investigations. Mrs. Wheeler's hands twisted in her lap. "At first, I told myself I was just being thorough, but deep down, I knew what we were doing was wrong. Dr. Harris had a way of making it sound reasonable, placing babies with families who could provide better opportunities, protecting mothers from additional stress. But they were separated from their families," Emma said, her voice quiet but firm. "From their sisters." "Yes," Mrs. Wheeler whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "I tried to justify it. The wealthy families could provide everything a child needed. The mothers would be placed in good homes, given chances they might not have had otherwise. But watching you girls now, seeing how you found each other despite everything, I know we were wrong." Emily leaned forward. "Mrs. Wheeler, we're not here to judge you. We just want to understand, to help other families who might be searching for each other." The former nurse nodded, rising to retrieve a large box from a nearby closet. "I kept everything," she explained, setting it on the coffee table. "Every case I witnessed, every transfer I was part of. I couldn't bring myself to destroy the records, even after I left nursing." As they began going through the documents, a pattern emerged that confirmed their suspicions. Harris had developed a systematic approach, identifying multiple births where one parent had significant resources and the other was in a vulnerable position, whether through illness, financial difficulties, or other circumstances. He would arrange for complications during delivery, Mrs. Wheeler explained, her voice heavy with regret. The mothers would be sedated, told there had been problems. In the confusion, one baby would be transferred to a pre-selected facility. The paperwork would be modified, records altered. "How many cases?" Michael asked, taking careful notes. "That I personally witnessed? At least 15 over the years. I worked with him. But Harris operated at multiple hospitals, had other teams. The total number could be much higher." Grace, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Why did you stay? If you knew it was wrong?" Mrs. Wheeler's face crumpled slightly. "Fear at first. Harris made it clear that our careers would be over if we spoke up. Then guilt. The weight of knowing became too heavy to bear. How could I come forward without admitting my own role? But watching your stories unfold in the media, seeing the healing that's possible, I knew it was time." "Julia knew people would come forward," James said softly. She believed that once the truth started emerging, others would find the courage to speak up. Mrs. Wheeler wiped her eyes. "Your wife was remarkable, Mr. Carter. She came closer to exposing the truth than anyone else had. When I heard about her passing, I almost came forward then, but fear held me back. I am sorry." "You're helping now," Clara assured her. "That's what matters." The girls worked methodically through the records, their experience from previous investigations evident in their organized approach. They identified patterns, cross-referenced dates and locations, and carefully documented everything that might help locate other separated families. "There's something else you should know," Mrs. Wheeler said as the afternoon wore on. Harris didn't work alone. There were board members, administrators at various hospitals who helped cover everything up. Some of them are still in positions of power. Michael straightened in his chair. "We'll need names, dates, anything you can provide. These people need to be held accountable. And we need to protect the families who are just discovering the truth," Emily added, showing wisdom beyond her years. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Wheeler stopped them at the door. "I've carried this burden for so long," she said, looking at the four girls. "Watching you together, Seeing how you've turned your pain into purpose, it gives me hope that some good can come from all of this." Back in the car, the girls immediately began organizing their notes, their excitement about the new information tempered by the weight of what they had learned. "Dad," Emily said thoughtfully, "we're going to need a bigger office and more help." James smiled, reminded again of Julia's vision. "I think you're right. This is becoming bigger than we imagined. But that's good, isn't it?" Grace asked. "The bigger it gets, the more families we can help." "Exactly what Mom would have wanted," Clara agreed, sharing a knowing look with her sister. As they drove back to their hotel, James reflected on how far they had come from that chance encounter in the park. Julia's quest for truth had grown into something extraordinary, a movement led by the very children whose lives had been affected, working to ensure that other families would have the chance to be whole again. The Julia Carter Foundation's headquarters buzzed with unprecedented activity. In the weeks following Margaret Wheeler's revelations, the organization had grown exponentially. New staff members occupied recently renovated offices, while volunteers managed the constantly ringing phones. At the heart of it all, the four girls maintained their special corner, now equipped with additional computers and a dedicated research space. "Another match confirmed," Emily announced, hanging up her phone with barely contained excitement. A family in Chicago just got their DNA results. They matched with a girl in Seattle. Same birth date, same hospital, same circumstances. Clara immediately began updating their digital database, which had become an intricate web of connections linking separated families across the country. "That's the third confirmation this week," she noted, adding another pin to their interactive map. Emma and Grace, who had officially joined the Foundation's youth outreach program, were reviewing letters from other children in orphanages and foster homes who suspected they might have siblings. "Listen to this one," Grace said, holding up a letter. "This girl in Texas says she's always had dreams about a sister who looks just like her. She saw our story on the news and recognized the feeling we described, that constant sense that something was missing." James watched from his office doorway, marveling at how naturally the girls had taken to their roles. They had become the heart of the Foundation, their personal experiences lending credibility and understanding to their interactions with other families. Mr. Carter, his assistant, appeared with a tablet displaying breaking news. The hospital board in Philadelphia just announced an internal investigation. They're specifically citing Mrs. Wheeler's testimony. The ripple effect of Margaret Wheeler's confession had been extraordinary. Other former hospital staff members had begun coming forward, each new testimony adding weight to their case. Harris's network was unraveling rapidly, exposing decades of systematic deception. Michael burst into the office, his usually calm demeanor animated with urgency. "We got something big," he announced, settling into a chair. "Remember those board members Mrs. Wheeler mentioned? One of them wants to talk." The girls immediately abandoned their tasks, gathering around to listen. They had earned their place in these discussions, their insights often proving invaluable. "Dr. Patricia Collins," Michael continued, pulling up a file on his laptop. "She was on the board at 3 different hospitals where Harris worked. She says she has documentation that could help us identify dozens more cases. Why is she coming forward now?" Clara asked, her experience making her cautiously optimistic. She says watching these families reunite changed her perspective, seeing the real impact of what they did. Michael paused, glancing at the 4 girls. She says she can't stay silent anymore. James studied the preliminary information Michael had brought. Dr. Collins had been young when she joined the first hospital board, eager to advance her career. Harris had taken her under his wing, gradually involving her in his scheme. "She's taking a huge risk," Emma observed. "These revelations could end her career." "Sometimes doing the right thing requires sacrifice," Emily said quietly, touching her locket, a gesture she and Clara still shared in moments of significance. Grace nodded in agreement. "Like your mom." She knew exposing the truth might have consequences, but she did it anyway. James felt a familiar ache in his chest at the mention of Julia. She would have been amazed to see how her initial investigation had grown into this movement for truth and justice. "We should meet with her," Clara suggested. "All of us. Show her that coming forward can lead to healing, not just consequences. The others quickly agreed. They had learned that their presence, living proof of families reunited, often help encourage hesitant witnesses to share their stories. Mrs. Bennett, who had been quietly organizing files nearby, spoke up. "I'll prepare the conference room. Dr. Collins might feel more comfortable in a less formal setting." As preparations for the meeting began, Eleanor Harper arrived for her weekly update. The journalist had become a trusted ally, helping to manage media coverage of their growing investigation. "The public response has been overwhelming," she reported, showing them the latest analytics. "Your story has inspired people across the country to question similar adoption irregularities. Support groups are forming in multiple cities." "Mom would have loved that," Emily said, smiling at Clara. "She always said the truth has a way of creating communities." James watched as the girls returned to their work, each focused on their specific tasks but moving in synchronized harmony. Emma and Grace had adapted seamlessly to the Foundation's mission, their own experience adding another layer of understanding to their investigations. "You know," Eleanor observed quietly, "when I first wrote about your family story, I thought it was extraordinary. But what's happening now, this movement you created, it's revolutionary. You're not just reuniting families. You're changing the way people think about truth, justice, and the power of never giving up." James nodded, his eyes on the wall of photos that had grown to include dozens of reunited families. Each image told a story of loss, discovery, and healing. Each smile represented another piece of Julia's legacy. "The girls are the real revolution," he said softly. "They've taken their own pain and transformed it into purpose. They're finishing what Julia started, but they're doing it in their own way." As if to prove his point, the four girls were already deep in discussion about Dr. Collins' upcoming visit, planning questions and preparing documents. They had developed an intuitive understanding of how to approach these sensitive conversations, combining their natural empathy with the investigative skills they'd learned from Julia's notes. The Foundation had become more than just a vehicle for investigation. It was a beacon of hope for families who had spent years feeling incomplete, and at its heart were four extraordinary girls who refused to let fear or convention stand in the way of uncovering the truth. Dr. Patricia Collins arrived at the Foundation on a rainy Tuesday morning, her professional demeanor barely masking her nervous energy. Alexander smiled, his eyes softening as he looked at his daughter. "When I first brought you home, Sarah, all I could think about was making up for lost time, for the years we'd missed. I wanted to give you and Sophie the life you deserved. But your mother, she always saw the bigger picture. She knew that our story wasn't just about us. It was about helping others find their way back to each other. And now, seeing what you've all built here, it's beyond anything I could have imagined." Sarah returned his smile, her hand instinctively touching the locket around her neck. "Mom would be proud, wouldn't she?" "More than proud," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "She'd be amazed at how you've taken her work and made it your own. You've turned her vision into something extraordinary." The office buzzed with activity around them, the hum of voices and the clatter of keyboards filling the air. The Foundation had become a hub of hope, a place where families could come to find answers, to heal, and to reconnect. And at the center of it all were four remarkable girls who had turned their own pain into a force for good. Sophie appeared at the door, her tablet in hand. "Dad, we got another lead. A family in Chicago just reached out. They think their daughter might have been separated at birth. We're pulling the records now." Alexander nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "Let's get to work, then. Every family deserves the chance to be whole." As the girls returned to their tasks, Alexander stood in the doorway, watching them. They moved with purpose, their determination evident in every action. Sophie and Sarah, Emma and Grace, they had become more than sisters. They were a team united by their shared mission and their unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth. Mrs. Martinez appeared at his side, her notebook in hand. "They're incredible, aren't they?" she said softly. "Julia would be so proud of what they've accomplished." "She would," Alexander agreed, his gaze still on the girls. She always believed in the power of truth, in the strength of family. And now, through them, her legacy lives on. The Foundation's work continued to grow, each new case bringing them closer to their goal. The girls' dedication and empathy had inspired others to come forward, to share their stories and seek the truth. And with each reunion, each family made whole, the foundation's impact grew stronger. As the autumn sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the office, Alexander felt a sense of peace. The journey had been long and difficult, but they had found their way, and now they were helping others do the same. The foundation was more than just an organization. It was a testament to the power of love, of family, and of the truth that binds us all together. And at its heart were four extraordinary girls who had turned their own story of separation into a beacon of hope for countless others. Alexander smiled, remembering the confused, hopeful girl who had appeared in the park that day. "Your mother imagined it," he replied. "She knew that finding the truth about our family would lead to something bigger." "The truth has a way of growing," Sophie quoted from Julia's notes, a phrase that had become something of a motto for their work. A commotion at the reception desk drew their attention. A woman arrived unannounced, clutching a folder and looking nervous. The security team, well-trained in handling unexpected visitors, had already moved to intercept her. "Wait," Emma called out, studying the woman's face. "She looks like one of the nurses from the photos Mrs. Wheeler gave us." The woman turned at Emma's voice, her eyes widening as she took in the two sets of twins. "I worked with Dr. Harris," she said, her voice trembling, "at 3 different hospitals. And I can't stay silent anymore." The girls immediately shifted into their well-practiced routine for handling new witnesses. Grace went to get water, while Emily and Clara guided the woman to their interview room. Emma retrieved their standard documentation forms, her movements synchronized with her sister's without the need for words. "What's your name?" Clara asked gently, once they were settled. "Linda Martinez," the woman replied. "No relation to your Mrs. Bennett. I was a delivery nurse for 20 years. I saw things that have haunted me ever since." James watched from the doorway as his daughters and their friends handled the interview with remarkable professionalism. They had developed an intuitive understanding of how to make witnesses feel comfortable, how to ask the right questions, and how to piece together a fragment of information into a coherent narrative. "We'll need to verify everything," Michael reminded them quietly. "Of course," Emily agreed. "But look at these hospital records she brought. They match the timeline we already established from Dr. Collins' documents." The foundation had become a beacon of hope, not just for separated families, but for those who had carried the burden of silence for years. Each new witness who came forward helped them understand more about how Harris's network had operated and how they could prevent similar injustices in the future. As the afternoon progressed, more details emerged from Linda's testimony. She had worked primarily in the nursery, witnessing countless separations but feeling powerless to stop them. Like others before her, she had kept records, small notes, photographs that might someday help reveal the truth. "I used to look at the babies," she confessed, tears rolling down her cheeks, "and wonder if they would ever find each other again, if they would feel that something was missing from their lives, like you all did." Emma reached across the table to squeeze the woman's hand. "They will find each other," she said firmly. "That's why we're here. That's why your testimony is so important." The Julia Carter Foundation's 6-month anniversary celebration was intentionally modest, a small gathering in the conservatory that had become the heart of the foundation. The room was filled with orchids, Julia's favorite flowers, now tended by her daughters with the same care she had once shown. Among the guests were families they had helped reunite, each with their own story of loss and rediscovery. The Martinez twins from Houston sat with their parents, still marveling at their newfound connection. The Winters family had flown in from California, their daughter Amanda inseparable from her newly discovered sister. "I never thought this day would come," Sister Margaret said, watching the interactions with tears in her eyes. "When Clara first came to St. Anne's, I sensed there was something special about her. But this is beyond anything I could have imagined." James stood near the back of the room, observing the scene with quiet pride. Emily and Clara were showing a group of recently reunited siblings their research center, explaining how they used Julia's methods to track down connections. Emma and Grace led a support group for children still adjusting to their new family dynamics. "Your wife would be so proud," Mrs. Bennett said softly, appearing at his side, "not just of what the foundation has accomplished, but of how the girls have grown into their roles." Indeed, the transformation had been remarkable. The shy, uncertain Clara who had first entered their lives had become confident and purposeful. Emily had discovered leadership abilities she never knew she possessed. Together with Emma and Grace, they had created something extraordinary, a place where broken families could find healing and hope. Eleanor Harper, working on a follow-up piece about the foundation, was interviewing Dr. Collins and other former hospital staff who had come forward. Their testimonies had been crucial in understanding the full scope of Harris's network and in helping other institutions recognize and address similar issues. "Dad," Emily called, waving him over to where she and Clara stood with a newly arrived family. "This is the Richardson family. They found us through the website yesterday." The Richardsons looked nervous but hopeful, clutching a folder of documents much like the ones Julia had collected. Their story, as it emerged, followed the familiar pattern: a confused delivery, sedated mother, and years of unanswered questions. "We'll help you," Clara assured them, her voice confident and compassionate. "We have a whole team now and a process that works. You're not alone anymore." The Foundation's approach had evolved significantly since their early days. They now offered comprehensive support, legal assistance, counseling, DNA testing, and, perhaps most importantly, a community of people who understood exactly what these families were going through. "Sometimes I wonder," Emma mused later, as they cleared away the celebration decorations, "how many more families are out there? How many people don't even know they should be looking?" "That's why our outreach program is so important," Grace replied, referring to their newest initiative. "The more stories we share, the more people will recognize their own situations." The Foundation had recently launched a series of educational programs, working with hospitals and adoption agencies to improve transparency and record-keeping. They were also developing resources for medical professionals who might encounter similar cases in the future. "Mom would have loved this part," Emily said, carefully wrapping a leftover cake for Sister Margaret to take back to St. Anne's. "She always said that healing happens in communities, not in isolation." Clara nodded, touching her locket, a gesture that had become less frequent but no less meaningful. "Remember what she wrote in her letter? About how the truth has a way of creating connections." "Speaking of connections," Michael interrupted, approaching. "The Denver Hospital Board just confirmed our meeting for next week. They're interested in implementing our recommended protocols for multiple birth deliveries." James watched as the girls immediately began planning their presentation, their enthusiasm unchanged despite the long day. They had become experts at sharing their story in ways that inspired institutional change while protecting the privacy of the families involved. Mrs. Bennett began turning off lights in conservatory, leaving only the soft glow of decorative lanterns. The orchids cast delicate shadows on the walls, reminiscent of the day Julia had first planted them. "You know what makes this place special," she said thoughtfully. "It's not just about reuniting families. It's about creating a space where healing can happen naturally, where people can find their way back to each other in their own time." James agreed, thinking of how their own family's journey had led to this moment. The Foundation had become more than just a mission to expose the truth. It was a living testament to Julia's belief in the power of love and persistence. As the evening wound down, the four girls gathered in their favorite corner, surrounded by the evidence of their work. Maps showing connected cases, folders of ongoing investigations, and most importantly, the wall of smiling photographs. Families made whole again. "Sometimes I think about that day in the park," Clara said softly. "How scared I was to speak up, to say what I believed to be true." "I'm glad you did," Emily replied, hugging her sister. "Look at all the good that's come from that one moment of courage." Emma and Grace nodded in agreement, their own story reunion now woven inextricably into the Foundation's larger narrative. Together, they had created something beautiful from their experiences of loss and separation, a place where truth could emerge, where healing could begin, and where families could find their way home. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the Denver Medical Center's boardroom, where James sat with Emily and Clara, preparing for their presentation. The girls had insisted on being part of this meeting, arguing that their personal experience would make the strongest case for institutional change. "Remember," Michael whispered as board members began filing in, "these people are allies now. Dr. Collins's testimony changed everything." Indeed, the atmosphere was different from their earlier confrontations with hospital administrators. Instead of defensive posturing, they were met with genuine interest and concern. Dr. Helen Rivera, the current board chair, had been particularly vocal about wanting to make amends for past wrongs. "Before we begin," Dr. Rivera addressed the room, "I want to thank the Julia Carter Foundation for their tireless work in bringing these issues to light." Julia Thompson believed in the power of truth, but she also believed in the power of institutions to change, to do better once they understood the impact of their actions. The presentation moved into the practical aspects of their proposed changes. The foundation had developed comprehensive guidelines for handling multiple births, ensuring transparency, and maintaining detailed records. They had also created support systems for families who might face challenging circumstances during pregnancy and delivery. "The key," James explained, "is creating an environment where ethical concerns can be raised without fear of retaliation. Many of our witnesses have told us they stayed silent because they felt powerless to challenge the system." Back at the Foundation's office, Emma and Grace were coordinating with their expanding network of support groups. The Foundation now offered regular meetings for reunited families, helping them navigate the complexities of their new relationships. Another call from St. Vincent's. Grace announced as James, Emily, and Clara returned from Denver. They've identified 3 more cases that match Harris's pattern. Sister Angela is already reviewing their records. The Foundation's work had created a ripple effect throughout the adoption and medical communities. Orphanages and hospitals across the country were re-examining their historical records, looking for cases that might have been mishandled. "What if," Emily suggested during their afternoon strategy meeting, "we bring together all the institutions we've worked with, share best practices, and create a unified approach to handling these cases?" "Mom would have loved that idea," Clara agreed, already pulling up their contact database. "She always said that lasting change happens through collaboration, not confrontation." Mrs. Bennett, who had been quietly observing from her desk, spoke up. "Why not make it an annual event? The Julia Carter Conference on Family Reunification and Ethical Healthcare Practices." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic approval. The Foundation had grown beyond its original mission of reuniting separated twins. It was now shaping policy, influencing institutional practices, and creating lasting change in the healthcare system. "We'll need a bigger venue than the conservatory this time," Emma noted, thinking of their recent 6-month celebration. "Maybe we could use a convention center downtown." James watched as the girls began planning, their natural organizational abilities shining through. They had grown so much in these past months, taking on responsibilities that would have seemed impossible when they first started. "Dad," Emily called, noticing his thoughtful expression. "What do you think about inviting some of the families we've helped to speak at the conference? Let them share their stories directly?" "That's exactly what your mother would have suggested," he replied, smiling at how often Julia's influence appeared in their work. Personal stories have a way of making abstract issues real and immediate. As the day progressed, more developments unfolded. Eleanor Harper called with news that her latest article had prompted another former nurse to come forward with records from a hospital in Seattle. Michael received confirmation that 3 more DNA tests had come back positive, confirming suspected matches they had been investigating. "It never stops amazing me," Grace said as they updated their wall of success stories, "how each new case leads to another. It's like Mom's research was just the beginning of a much bigger story." "That's because she understood something fundamental," Clara replied, adjusting a photograph of recently reunited twins from Michigan. She knew that truth doesn't exist in isolation. Each revelation connects to others, creating a web of understanding that grows stronger with every new discovery. The Foundation's office hummed with activity as staff members coordinated various projects. Support group meetings, investigation follow-ups, legal consultations. What had started in one corner of James's corporate building now occupied an entire floor, with plans to expand further. "We're going to need more help soon," Emma observed, reviewing their growing caseload. Maybe we could start an internship program, train other young people who want to help with family reunification work. The suggestion sparked an animated discussion about the Foundation's future. They had already developed comprehensive training materials based on Julia's methods and their own experiences. Why not share that knowledge with others who felt called to this work? Think about it, Emily said excitedly. We could create a whole network of investigators and support staff, all trained to handle these cases with the same care and attention to detail that Mom used in her research. James listened to their plans with pride and a touch of amazement. Julia's quest for truth had grown into something far beyond what any of them had imagined. Through their daughter's dedication and hard work, her legacy was touching lives across the country, creating positive change in ways that would continue long into the future. As autumn painted Central Park in shades of gold and crimson, Emily and Clara stood near the spot where they had first met. The bench where James had sat that fateful day was now marked with a small plaque, a dedication to Julia Carter and the foundation that bore her name. It feels like a lifetime ago, Clara mused, touching her locket. I was so scared that day, but something inside me knew I had to speak up. And now look at us, Emily replied, gesturing to the small crowd gathering nearby. They had chosen this meaningful location for a special announcement, the official launch of the Julia Carter Foundation's Youth Ambassador Program. Emma and Grace were already setting up the presentation materials, coordinating with the Foundation's media team. They had selected 20 young people from across the country to be the first cohort of ambassadors, each with their own connection to family separation and reunion. Ready? James asked, approaching with Mrs. Bennett. They had both watched the girls grow into their leadership roles, becoming advocates and mentors for others facing similar journeys. The ceremony began with Clara sharing their story, not just of finding each other, but of discovering their mother's legacy and building something meaningful from their experience. Emily followed an overview of the Foundation's accomplishments. 37 families reunited, 15 hospitals implementing new protocols, and countless lives touched by their work. But today isn't about looking back, Emma announced, stepping forward. It's about moving forward, about expanding our reach and helping more families find their way home. Grace introduced the youth ambassadors, each selected for their passion and commitment to the Foundation's mission. Some were reunited siblings themselves, while others had been inspired by the stories they'd witnessed through the Foundation's work. Julia Carter believed in the power of truth to create positive change, one young ambassador said during her introduction. Through this program, we're carrying that belief forward, reaching into new communities and helping more families discover their own hidden connections. The program would train ambassadors in investigation techniques, counseling support, and advocacy work. They would learn to handle cases with the same care and attention to detail that had become the Foundation's hallmark. Look at them, Mrs. Bennett whispered to James as the young people gathered for photos. Julia would be so proud of how her work has grown, how it's inspiring a new generation. Indeed, watching an enthusiastic group of ambassadors interact with his daughters, James felt Julia's presence strongly. She had always believed that young people had a special capacity for empathy and understanding, especially in matters of family and identity. After the ceremony, the 4 girls led their new team on a tour of the park, sharing stories and building connections that would strengthen their work together. The autumn breeze carried the sound of their laughter, a reminder of how far they had come from the tension and uncertainty of their first meeting. "Dad," Emily called, waving him over to where the group had gathered by the pond. "We want to show them the ducks. It's kind of become our tradition with new team members." James smiled, remembering how Emily had been feeding these same ducks the day Clara found them. Now, watching the ambassadors toss breadcrumbs and share their own stories, he saw how natural elements could help ease difficult conversations and build trust. "We should make this part of our regular training," Grace suggested. "Bringing new team members here, letting them feel the significance of where everything started." "It's like Mom always wrote in her notes," Clara added. "The most important breakthroughs often happen in unexpected places, when people feel comfortable enough to share their truth." As the afternoon progressed, more Foundation members arrived, including some of the families they had helped reunite. The park became a gathering place for celebration and reflection, with small groups scattered across the grass, sharing experiences and offering support to those still early in their journey. "You've created something extraordinary," Eleanor Harper observed, having arrived to document the ambassador program's launch. "This isn't just about finding lost family members anymore. It's about creating a community where healing can happen naturally." The girls had insisted on ending the day with a special ceremony by Julia's plaque. Each ambassador placed a single orchid, Julia's favorite flower, near the bench, symbolizing their commitment to carrying forward her legacy of truth and healing. "Mom always said that flowers have a way of bringing people together," Emily explained to the group. "They remind us that growth takes time, that beauty can emerge from difficult circumstances if we nurture it properly." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, James watched his daughters with the new ambassadors. They had taken their own experience of loss and transformation and turned it into a source of hope for others. Julia's work, begun in solitude as she fought to uncover the truth about their family, had blossomed into a movement that would continue touching lives for generations to come. "The truth really does have a way of growing," Clara said softly, standing beside him. "Just like Mom always believed it would." The park had quieted now, with only the gentle rustle of leaves and distant city sounds providing accompaniment to their reflections. This place, where their journey had begun with a chance encounter and a brave declaration of truth, had become sacred ground, a testament to the power of love, persistence, and the unbreakable bonds of family. The Julia Carter Conference Center buzzed with activity as delegates from across the country gathered for the Foundation's first international symposium. What had started as a simple idea during their strategy meeting had grown into a major event, drawing participants from hospitals, adoption agencies, and family advocacy groups worldwide. Emily and Clara stood at the registration desk, greeting arrivals alongside Emma and Grace. The four girls had become the face of the Foundation, their story inspiring others to examine their own family histories and institutional practices. "Dr. Ramirez is here from Mexico City," Emily announced, checking her tablet. "Her hospital network has identified several cases that match Harris's pattern. They're requesting our help with the investigations." The Foundation's influence had begun spreading beyond American borders, as similar cases emerged in other countries. Julia's meticulous research methods were being adapted to help families across different cultures and legal systems. "The Australian delegation just arrived too," Grace added, directing them to the main conference hall. "They're particularly interested in our DNA database system." James watched from a mezzanine level, pride swelling in his chest. The conference center, recently dedicated in Julia's name, was a testament to how far they had come. The modern building featured state-of-the-art research facilities, counseling rooms, and a permanent exhibition space documenting the Foundation's journey. Mr. Carter, one of their youth ambassadors, approached with an urgent message. The team in Seattle just confirmed another match. Twins separated at birth in 1989. One raised in Washington State, the other in British Columbia. "Have Emily and Clara coordinate with our Canadian partners," he replied, noting how naturally he had come to rely on his daughter's expertise. They've handled cross-border cases before. The morning's keynote session began with a powerful presentation. The Martinez twins from Houston, now active Foundation volunteers, shared their story of reunion and healing. Their parents spoke about the joy and challenges of rebuilding family bonds, while their youth ambassador discussed the support systems that had helped them through the process. "Every story matters," Clara emphasized during her introduction of the next speaker. "Each family we help adds another piece to our understanding of how these separations happened and how we can prevent them in the future." Dr. Collins, who had become a valuable ally in their work, presented new research on the psychological impacts of family separation and reunion. Her data, collected from the Foundation's growing network of supported families, provided crucial insights for healthcare providers and counseling professionals. Between sessions, the girls gathered in what they still called their corner. Though it had evolved into a sophisticated command center within the new building, the wall of success stories had grown so large it now required its own dedicated space, with interactive displays allowing visitors to explore each family's journey. "Remember when this was just the four of us working from Dad's office?" Emma mused, watching volunteers coordinate with international partners via video conference. Mom would never have imagined this, Emily said, touching her locket. Well, maybe she would have. She always saw possibilities that others miss. The afternoon sessions focused on practical applications of their work. Foundation teams demonstrated their investigation methods, sharing the updated versions of Julia's research protocols. Young ambassadors led workshops on family support and community building, while legal experts discussed the complexities of international family reunification. We're receiving reports from the Singapore team, Grace announced during their afternoon briefing. They've identified a pattern of separations in Southeast Asia that might be connected to Harris's network. Multiple hospitals, same time period, Clara noted, examining the data. And look at this. Some of the administrative staff had connections to the hospitals we investigated here. James joined their discussion, remembering how Julia had once theorized that the separation scheme might have international reach. Her notes had hinted at global connections, though she hadn't lived long enough to explore them fully. Your mother would be amazed, Mrs. Bennet said, bringing them their usual afternoon tea. Not just by how far the Foundation has come, but by how you girls have grown into your roles. Indeed, watching his daughters coordinate with international teams and mentor young ambassadors, James saw Julia's influence in every aspect of their work. They had inherited her determination, her attention to detail, and most importantly, her compassion for families seeking answers. Dad, Emily called out suddenly, the team in Vancouver needs our help with a delicate situation. They found a potential match, but one of the families is hesitant about coming forward. We could go, Clara suggested. Emma and Grace can handle things here when we went to Denver. And sometimes families need to see firsthand that reunion is possible. The suggestion sparked a familiar warmth in James's chest. His daughters had developed an intuitive understanding of what separated families needed. Not just practical help, but hope and reassurance from others who had walked the same path. As the day's sessions wound down, participants gathered in the central atrium where Julia's portrait hung above a peaceful water feature. The space had been designed to encourage reflection and conversation, with comfortable seating areas and walls lined with stories of reunion and healing. It's amazing, one of the international delegates commented, how one family story could create such positive change in the world. Looking at his daughters among their growing network of supporters and allies, James knew it was more than just their story. It was Julia's legacy of persistence and hope, transformed by their daughters into a global movement for truth and family reunification. As winter draped New York in a gentle blanket of snow, the Julia Carter Foundation prepared for another milestone. The holiday season brought a special gathering, a celebration of 50 successful reunions, each representing a family made whole through their work. The Foundation's conservatory, now triple its original size, had been transformed into a winter wonderland. Julia's beloved orchids still held pride of place, but they were joined by festive decorations and twinkling lights that reflected off the glass ceiling. Everything's ready for the families, Mrs. Bennet announced, surveying the space with satisfaction. Rose has outdone herself with the catering, and the youth ambassadors have prepared something special for the ceremony. Emily and Clara, dressed in matching blue dresses that complemented their lockets, were greeting early arrivals. Emma and Grace coordinated with the Foundation support team, ensuring that each family felt welcomed and comfortable. The Richardson twins are here, Emma called out, waving to the recently reunited sisters they had helped in Vancouver. And look, they brought their whole extended family. The celebration was more than just a marker of their success. It was a testament to the healing power of truth and persistence. Families mingled freely, sharing stories and offering support to those still adjusting to their new relationships. I remember our first meeting, Clara said softly to a young girl who had just found her twin brother. It feels overwhelming at first, but you'll find your rhythm. The connection was always there, waiting to be rediscovered. James watched from his usual spot near Julia's portrait as the room filled with laughter and conversation. Sister Margaret had arrived from St. Anne's with some of her current charges, children who might one day discover their own hidden family connections. Your girls have created something miraculous here, Sister Margaret said, joining him. Not just finding lost siblings, but building a community where healing can happen naturally. The youth ambassadors began their presentation, a moving tribute to Julia's work and its continuing impact. They had compiled video messages from reunited families across the globe, each sharing how the foundation had changed their lives. Mom's research was just the beginning, Emily explained to the gathered crowd. She showed us that with dedication and courage, even the most carefully hidden truths can come to light. Clara continued, but what we've learned is that finding each other is just the first step. Real healing happens in moments like this, when families can share their journeys and support each other through the challenges of reunion. The foundation had evolved to provide comprehensive support services. They now offer counseling, legal assistance, and ongoing community engagement for families at every stage of their journey. The Youth Ambassador Program had expanded to include training for healthcare professionals and adoption agency staff. "Look at this," Grace whispered to Emma, showing her phone. The Singapore team just confirmed another match. Twin sisters separated at birth, one in Malaysia, one in Australia. "Our 51st reunion," Emma noted with a smile. "Should we tell everyone?" But before they could share the news, the youth ambassadors called everyone's attention to a special presentation. They had created a memorial wall featuring photographs of all 50 reunited families, with Julia's portrait at the center. Every story on this wall began with a mother's intuition, one ambassador explained. Whether it was Julia Carter's determination to uncover the truth about her daughters, or the countless other mothers who never stopped believing they had more than one child. The ceremony continued with families adding their own photographs to the wall, each placement accompanied by tears of joy and shared embraces. The foundation's work had created a ripple effect of healing that extended far beyond the initial act of reunion. "Dad," Emily said, joining James near Julia's portrait, "do you think Mom knew how big this would become?" James wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Your mother believed that truth has its own power. She knew that once we started uncovering these stories, others would find the courage to seek their own answers." Clara joined them, followed by Emma and Grace. The four girls who had once been strangers had become not just friends, but partners in continuing Julia's legacy. Their bond, forged through shared experience and purpose, was as strong as any biological connection. "We should make this an annual tradition," Grace suggested. "Not just celebrating the reunions, but honoring the journey that brought us all together. And remembering that there are still more families out there," Emma added, "more stories waiting to be uncovered." As the evening progressed, James observed the natural interactions between families at different stages of their journey. Those who had been reunited longer offered guidance to newly connected siblings. Parents shared their experiences of healing and integration. Even the foundation staff and volunteers moved through the crowd with the easy familiarity of people who understood the deep emotional significance of their work. "Julia would have loved this," Mrs. Bennett said, joining their small group. "Not just the reunions, but the community you've built around them, the way you've turned individual healing into collective strength." The girls exchanged knowing smiles, their hands automatically going to their lockets, a gesture that had become symbolic of their connection to Julia's legacy. They had taken their mother's work and transformed it into something far greater than any of them had imagined possible. As snow fell gently outside the conservatory's glass ceiling, the gathered families represented a living testament to the power of persistence, truth, and love. Each reunion was a story of hope, each healing journey a reminder that it's never too late to find your way home. Spring brought new life to the Julia Carter Foundation's gardens, where Emily and Clara often retreated for moments of quiet reflection. The space had been designed to honor their mother's love of growing things, with winding paths and secluded benches nestled among blooming flowers. "Can you believe it's been almost a year?" Clara asked, touching a newly opened orchid. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I found you in the park, and other times it seems like we've never been apart." Emily nodded, understanding exactly what her sister meant. The past year had transformed their lives in ways none of them could have predicted. The foundation had grown from a small family mission into an international organization, yet they had managed to maintain the personal touch that made their work so effective. "Miss Carter?" A young intern approached hesitantly, still adjusting to the fact that this title could refer to either sister. "The team from Johns Hopkins is here for the training session." The foundation had recently launched a comprehensive training program for medical institutions, teaching them to identify potential separation cases and implement preventive protocols. Today's session will be led by all 4 girls, each sharing their unique perspective on the importance of family preservation. Dr. Harris's sentencing is tomorrow, Emma mentioned, as they prepared for the presentation. She and Grace had arrived early to help set up the training room. The media team wants to know if we should release a statement. The former hospital director had finally faced justice for his role in separating families. His trial had brought forward even more witnesses, each testimony adding to their understanding of how the separation scheme had operated. I think we should focus on the positive changes his actions inadvertently sparked, Grace suggested. How exposing the truth led to better practices and reunited families. James watched from the doorway as the girls discussed their approach. They had grown so much in the past year, developing wisdom that went far beyond their years. Julia would have been amazed by their ability to find hope and purpose in even the most challenging circumstances. The Singapore team sent their report, Michael announced, joining them with his ever-present tablet. 3 more matches confirmed in Southeast Asia. They're requesting our help with the reunification process. The Foundation's international expansion had required careful adaptation of their methods to different cultural contexts. The girls had shown remarkable sensitivity in understanding how family reunification might look different in various parts of the world. We should send Emily and Clara, Mrs. Bennett suggested. They have experience with cross-cultural cases, and their story resonates universally. The training session began with a full house. Medical professionals, social workers, and hospital administrators listened intently as the girls shared their experiences and introduced the Foundation's new protocols. What we learned from our mother's research, Emily explained, standing confidently at the podium, is that prevention is just as important as reunion. Every family kept together is a trauma avoided. Clara continued. But when separation does occur, having proper documentation and transparent processes makes reunion possible. That's why we're here today, to ensure that no other families have to spend years searching for answers. Emma and Grace led the practical portion of the training, demonstrating the database systems and documentation protocols they had developed. Their own experience as recently reunited twins added credibility to their instruction. Watch for these warning signs, Grace advised, highlighting specific patterns on the screen. Multiple birth deliveries with unusual complications, missing or altered records, inconsistent documentation. The session was interrupted by an urgent message from the Foundation's Seattle office. Another former nurse had come forward, bringing with her records from a previously unknown hospital in Harris's network. She says there could be dozens more cases, Emma reported, quickly reviewing the information, spanning almost 2 decades. The news sent a ripple of determination through the room. Even after a year of successes, they were still uncovering new layers of Harris's operation. But now they had the resources, experience, and support network to handle whatever they found. Mom always said the truth has a way of emerging in its own time, Clara reflected, sharing a meaningful look with Emily. She knew we just had to be patient and persistent. As the training session concluded, James found himself in Julia's garden, surrounded by the spring blooms she would have loved. The Foundation had become everything she had hoped for and more, a force for healing, a catalyst for change, and a testament to the power of maternal love. Sir, Mrs. Bennett appeared with his afternoon coffee. The girls want to show you something before the day ends. In the research center, Emily, Clara, Emma, and Grace had assembled a presentation that took his breath away. They had mapped out every case the Foundation had handled, creating a visual representation of families reunited and lives transformed. Look at this, Dad, Emily said excitedly. Each light represents a family we've helped. When we started, there were just the 4 of us. Now look how many lights are shining. The map glowed with countless points of light, each representing a story of loss, discovery, and reunion. But more than that, it showed the interconnected nature of their work, how each reunion created ripples that led to more discoveries, more healing, more hope. Julia will be so proud, Mrs. Bennett whispered, wiping away tears. Not just of what you've accomplished, but of who you become, Mrs. Bennett whispered, wiping away tears. The girls smiled, their hands instinctively going to their lockets. They had taken their mother's legacy and transformed it into something extraordinary, a movement that would continue touching lives for generations to come. The morning of Dr. Harris's sentencing dawned clear and bright, but the girls had decided not to attend the courthouse proceedings. Instead, they gathered at the foundation for what they considered a more important event, the launch of their new global family reunification network. Representatives from 20 countries, Emma announced, reviewing the attendance list, all committed to implementing our protocols and sharing information cross borders. The Foundation's main conference room had been transformed into a command center, with screens showing live feeds from partner organizations around the world. Each connection represented months of careful relationship building and adaptation of their methods to local contexts. The Australian team is already online, Grace reported, adjusting the video feed. And look, they've identified 3 potential matches using our new database system. Emily and Clara stood together at the main console, preparing to address their international partners. They had come so far from the frightened girls who first met in Central Park, growing into confident leaders who inspired others to join their cause. Should we tell them about the memorial garden first? Clara whispered to her sister. They had been working on a special project, a peaceful space where families had come to reflect, heal, and honor their journeys. Perfect way to start, Emily agreed. Show them that this work is about more than just data and DNA matches. It's about creating spaces for healing. James watched from the back of the room as his daughters began the presentation. Julia's portrait smiled down from the wall. Her presence felt in every aspect of their work. The Foundation had become everything she had hoped for and more, a beacon of hope for separated families worldwide. The Julia Carter Protocol, Clara explained to their global audience, isn't just about finding matches. It's about supporting families through every step of their journey, from investigation through reunion and beyond. The presentation included testimonials from families they had helped, demonstrating the lasting impact of their work. The Richardson twins spoke about their experience adapting to life as sisters. The Martinez family shared how their reunion had healed generations of pain. And now, Emily continued, we're expanding our youth ambassador program internationally, because every culture has its own way of understanding family, and we need local voices to help guide our work. As if on cue, Michael entered with breaking news from the courthouse. Harris had received a significant sentence, but more importantly, he had finally expressed remorse for his actions. His statement included an apology to all the families affected by his schemes. It's fitting, Emma observed, that this news comes as we're launching our global network. His actions caused so much pain, but look at all the good that's come from exposing the truth. Mrs. Bennett appeared with refreshments to the team, pausing to admire the wall of success stories that now included families from multiple continents. Julia always said that truth has a way of crossing borders, she remembered. She would be amazed to see how right she was. The day continued with virtual training sessions, policy discussions, and sharing of best practices across time zones. The Foundation's methods were being adapted for different legal systems and cultural contexts, while maintaining the core principles Julia had established in her research. Dad, Clara called during a break between sessions. Come see what the Singapore team just sent. On their main screen was a photograph of twin girls recently reunited in Malaysia, each wearing a locket similar to the ones Julia had left for Emily and Clara. The Foundation had begun creating these special lockets for reunited siblings, carrying forward a tradition that had meant so much to their own family. They're calling them Julia's lockets now, Grace explained. Each one contains a small compass, symbolizing how truth helps us find our way home. As the day drew to a close, the girls gathered in their corner of the office, now more of a command center, but still maintaining the intimate feel of their early days. They had made a tradition to end each significant day by reading from Julia's research journals. Listen to this, Emily said, opening to a marked page. She wrote, "The truth about family isn't just in DNA or documents. It's in the heart's recognition of what was always meant to be whole." The words resonated to the quiet office, touching everyone who had become part of their extended family. The Foundation staff, the international partners, the youth ambassadors. All had been drawn together by Julia's vision of healing and hope. She knew Clara said softly, touching her locket. Somehow she knew that bringing our family's truth to light would help others find their way home too. Outside, the city was bathed in the golden light of sunset, casting long shadows to the foundation's windows. But inside, the screens continued to glow with connections to their partners around the world, each point of light representing another chance for a family to become whole again. 1 year to the day after Clara and Emily's first meeting in Central Park, the Julia Carter Foundation hosted a special ceremony. The park bench where their story began had been transformed into a permanent memorial, surrounded by a beautiful garden filled with Julia's favorite orchids. "It feels different now," Clara mused, standing with Emily at the spot where she had first gathered the courage to speak up. "A year ago, I was so scared, but something inside me knew I had to take that chance. And now look at us," Emily replied, gesturing to the gathering crowd. Families from across the globe had come to celebrate the Foundation's first anniversary, each with their own story of separation, discovery, and reunion. Emma and Grace were greeting arrivals, directing them to the ceremony space where comfortable chairs had been arranged around the memorial bench. The Foundation's youth ambassadors, now numbering over 50, helped elderly relatives find seats and distributed programs printed with Julia's favorite quote about truth and healing. "Mr. Carter?" Sister Margaret approached with a group of children from St. Anne's. The children want to be part of this. They've been following every story of reunion, hoping. James nodded, understanding. The Foundation had maintained close ties with orphanages and children's homes, knowing that each child's story might hold pieces of a larger puzzle. The Malaysian team just confirmed another match, Michael announced quietly, showing his tablet to James. Twin boys separated at birth, now living in Singapore and Australia. They want to coordinate the reunion for next week. Mrs. Bennett appeared with a tray of Julia's specialty blend, which had become a tradition at Foundation events. She always said a warm cup of tea could help ease difficult conversations, she remembered, serving the aromatic beverage to gathered families. The ceremony began with Clara and Emily sharing their story, not just of finding each other, but discovering their mother's legacy and building something meaningful from their experience. They spoke of Julia's determination, her meticulous research, and her unwavering belief that truth would find its way to light. "Our mother knew that exposing our story would help others," Emily explained, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "But I don't think even she could have imagined how far her work would reach." A video presentation showed highlights from the past year. Families reunited across continents, hospitals implementing new protocols, young ambassadors carrying Julia's methods to new communities. Each success had created ripples that led to more discoveries, more healing, more hope. "The Foundation isn't just about finding lost siblings," Clara continued. "It's about healing the wounds that separation creates, not just in families, but in communities and institutions." Emma and Grace presented an update on their international network, now spanning 23 countries. Their own story of reunion had helped shape the Foundation's approach to supporting families through the complex emotions of rediscovery. "When we first met Emily and Clara," Grace shared, "we saw what was possible, how pain could be transformed into purpose, how loss could become a catalyst for positive change." James watched from near Julia's memorial as the ceremony continued. Sister Margaret spoke about the changes she'd seen in adoption practices. Dr. Collins discussed how hospitals were implementing new protocols to prevent future separations. Each speaker added another thread to the tapestry of healing their work had created. "Your wife would be so proud," Mrs. Bennett said softly, joining him. "Not just of what the Foundation has accomplished, but of how the girls have grown into their roles." Indeed, watching his daughters interact with the gathered families, James saw Julia's influence in every gesture, every careful word of comfort and encouragement. They had inherited her compassion, her attention to detail, and her unwavering commitment to truth. The ceremony concluded with a special tribute. Each reunited family placed an orchid at Julia's memorial, creating a living symbol of hope and renewal. The flowers, carefully chosen to bloom year-round, would serve as a reminder that growth and healing are ongoing processes. "Mom always said that gardens need constant care," Emily reflected, watching the procession of families. "Just like the work we do, it's never really finished, but that's what makes it beautiful." Clara nodded, touching her locket. And every new bloom leads to another, just like every story we uncover helps us find more families who need our help. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the park's trees, the gathered families shared stories and support. Children played near the memorial garden, while parents exchanged experiences and advice. The foundation staff and volunteers moved the crowd, making connections and noting details that might lead to more discoveries. "Look," Grace pointed out, drawing their attention to a young girl shyly approaching the memorial. "She's from the Singapore orphanage we've been working with, the one where we think there might be more cases like ours." The girl placed her orchid with careful reverence, then turned to watch other families adding their flowers. Her expression held the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that Clara had felt a year ago, standing in this very park. "Should we talk to her?" Emma suggested, recognizing the look in the girl's eyes. "Yes," Emily and Clara said together, already moving toward her. They understood better than anyone that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a simple conversation, a moment of connection, a shared hope for answers. As the anniversary celebration drew to a close, the Julia Carter Foundation's core team gathered in the conservatory for a private moment of reflection. The space had become their sanctuary, filled with the orchids Julia had loved and the memories of all they had accomplished in the past year. 75 families reunited. Emma read from their latest report. Over 200 youth ambassadors trained worldwide. 15 countries implementing the Julia Carter Protocol in their healthcare systems. "And that's just the beginning," Grace added, pulling up their project board. "The Asian network is expanding. European hospitals are adopting our guidelines. And the South American initiative launches next month." Emily and Clara sat together on their favorite bench, surrounded by blooming orchids. Their matching lockets caught the evening light, reminding everyone of how their journey had begun. "Sometimes I wonder," Clara said softly, "what Mom would think of all this. How her research has touched so many lives." "She knows," Emily replied with quiet certainty. "Remember what she wrote in her letter, about truth having a way of creating connections we never imagined possible." James watched his daughters, marveling at how they had grown from uncertain girls into confident young women. They had taken Julia's legacy and transformed it into something extraordinary, a global movement for truth, healing, and family reunification. "The foundation received another award," Michael announced, showing them the email. "The International Human Rights Commission wants to recognize our work in family advocacy and healthcare reform." Mrs. Bennett brought out Julia's special tea service, a tradition they maintained for important moments. "She always said that shared stories go better with warm tea," she remembered, pouring cups for everyone. As they settled into their usual places, Eleanor Harper joined them. The journalists had become part of their extended family, helping to share their story with sensitivity and understanding. "I'm working on a book," she revealed, "about Julia's research, the Foundation's work, and all the families you've helped. Would you be willing to share your perspectives?" The girls exchanged glances, having one of their silent conversations that still amazed everyone who witnessed them. "We think it's time," Emily said finally. "Not just our story, but all the stories that have become part of the Foundation's journey." "The world needs to understand," Clara added, "that family connections can survive anything. Time, distance, even deliberate separation. The heart always knows what's missing." Emma and Grace nodded in agreement. Their own story had become an integral part of the Foundation's narrative, showing how each reunion created ripples that led to more discoveries. "We should include the youth ambassadors' experiences too," Grace suggested. "How they're adapting our methods for different cultures and communities." "And the hospitals," Emma added. "How they're changing their practices, becoming more transparent, putting families first." James moved to stand near Julia's portrait, which watched over their gathering with that gentle smile he remembered so well. "Julia believed that truth has its own power," he said softly. "That once we start listening to our hearts, the path home becomes clear." As if in response to his words, a warm breeze stirred the orchids, carrying the subtle fragrance that would always remind them of Julia. The flowers she had tended with such care had multiplied and thrived, just as her work had grown beyond anything they could have imagined. "She left us more than just research," Mrs. Bennet observed, watching the girls work on their project plans. She left us a blueprint for healing, not just for our family, but for anyone seeking their true connections. The evening light painted a conservatory in soft gold, creating an almost magical atmosphere. In this peaceful moment, surrounded by the evidence of their year's work, they could feel the rightness of their path forward. What's next? Eleanor asked, her notebook ready. We keep growing, Emily answered simply. Keep helping families find each other. Keep improving the protocols. Keep sharing what we've learned. And we never forget how it started, Clara added, touching her locket, with one mother's determination to uncover the truth and two sisters brave enough to trust their hearts. As they continued planning and sharing ideas, the Foundation's global network hummed with activity. Somewhere in Singapore, a girl was discovering her connection to a family in Malaysia. In Brazil, a hospital was implementing Julia's protocols for the first time. In Australia, twins separated at birth were preparing for their first meeting. Each story was unique, yet connected by the common thread of hope that Julia had first woven with her careful research. Her legacy lived on not just in the Foundation's work, but in every family reunited, every truth uncovered, every heart made whole again. To Julia, James proposed, raising his teacup, and all the families still finding their way home. The others joined the toast, their cups catching the last rays of sunlight. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. But here, in their sanctuary, surrounded by Julia's flowers and the evidence of her lasting impact, they felt the peace that comes with knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. The Julia Carr Foundation had become more than just an organization. It was a living testament to the power of maternal love, the strength of family bonds, and the enduring nature of truth. And in the hearts of two sets of twins who had once been strangers, it was a fulfillment of a mother's final precious gift, the chance to make the world a little more whole, one family at a time.